I had not planned the trip carefully. It was one of those decisions that come suddenly without much thought, when you feel suffocated in your own life and just want to step away for a while. I packed my old backpack with what I thought I needed. Sleeping bag, tent, a small camping stove, 2 bottles of water, a headlamp, some dry food, and a knife I kept in my drawer. I told myself it would only be 2 nights, just enough to clear my head. I picked a random spot on the map, far from the main roads, somewhere marked only by forest and a small river winding through it. I thought the randomness of it would make it exciting, pure, unspoiled by the usual trails. I started hiking in the late afternoon. The sun was bright, the air heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. At first, the trail was easy. There were faint signs of others, old footprints in dry mud, a soda can rusting under a tree, a cigarette but pressed into the soil. After an hour, though, the forest swallowed all signs of people. The ground was covered with fallen leaves that muffled my steps, and every tree looked the same. The deeper I went, the more I realized how quiet it was. There were no cars, no hum of power lines, no voices, just the creak of branches, the occasional bird calling, and the sound of my boots breaking twigs. At first, that silence was calming. Later, I would find it unbearable. I stopped near the river when the sun had started sinking behind the trees. The water was clear, running cold over smooth stones. It looked like a good place to set up. I pitched my tent on a patch of flat ground just far enough from the bank so I wouldn't get soaked if it rained. I boiled some noodles on the little stove, ate quickly, and then crawled inside the tent as darkness fell. I lay there listening to the water and the wind. I thought it would lull me to sleep, but it didn't. Every little sound outside kept my nerves awake. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, the sudden flutter of wings. My heart jumped at everything. The tent's thin walls felt useless against whatever might be out there. But I told myself it was nothing, just the forest being alive. Eventually, I drifted off. When I woke, it was still dark. My watch said it was just after 3 a.m. I didn't know what woke me, but then I heard it. A soft crunching in the leaves outside, slow and heavy. I froze, holding my breath. It was not the light steps of a small animal. It sounded like something bigger. The steps moved closer, stopping now and then starting again. I felt the hair on my arms rise. I stayed still, barely breathing, waiting. The sound went past my tent and faded into the trees. I lay there for hours, unable to close my eyes again. At sunrise, I got out and checked the ground. The soil was soft from old rain. I saw prints in the mud near the river, pressed deep. They were human, bare feet, wide, dirty, pointing in the direction the sound had gone. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach tightening. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was some camper, someone like me, walking around at night. But who walks barefoot in the woods, miles from any road? I decided to stay alert but not let it ruin the trip. I filled my bottles from the river, packed some food in a small bag, and went exploring along the water. The woods were thick, but the river gave me a guide to follow. I walked for hours, listening to the gurgle of the current, stepping over mossy rocks, swatting away flies. The deeper I went, the more untouched everything seemed. There were no signs of people, no wrappers, no cut branches, nothing. Only the water, the trees, and the thick silence pressing around me. When I turned back toward camp, I noticed something I hadn't before. A rope tied high between 2 trees, frayed and dark from weather. It wasn't new. It looked like it had been there for years, sagging under its own weight. Beneath it was a patch of ground that looked disturbed, as if dug up long ago and left to settle again. I didn't want to think about it. I told myself it could be anything, a hunter's setup, an old swing, something forgotten. I walked faster back to my tent. When I reached camp, my stomach dropped. My backpack was unzipped. I knew I had closed it. Some of my food was gone, one of the bags of nuts and a packet of jerky. My knife, too, was missing. I stood there staring, my chest tight. I felt the air pressing heavy around me, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Someone had been here while I was gone. I checked the ground. Again, prints in the mud, bare feet, the same as before. They circled my tent, stopped at the backpack, then vanished into the trees. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every noise. I tried to eat but had no appetite. The thought of staying another night filled me with dread. But the hike back was long, and sunset was already near. I decided to pack up at first light and leave. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the tent with my headlamp in my hand, listening. The forest seemed alive with movement. Cracks, rustles, faint steps. Around midnight, I heard something that froze me solid. Breathing, slow, steady, just outside the tent wall. I held the knife I had kept by my sleeping bag, but then remembered it was gone. My chest pounded so hard I thought the sound would give me away. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever, then drifted off. When dawn came, I tore the tent down in minutes, shoving everything into the backpack. I didn't even cook breakfast. I just wanted out. My hands shook as I packed, my eyes darting at every shadow. I started back along the way I came, moving fast. The trees closed in around me. The forest seemed darker than before, the air colder. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat burned with thirst. The river guided me, but the trail was harder to follow now. At one point, I came across another disturbed patch of earth, larger than the first. Around it were old scraps of fabric, torn and buried under leaves. They looked like parts of a shirt, faded and rotting. I felt sick. My stomach turned as I realized these weren't random patches of ground. They were graves. I forced myself to keep walking, faster now, almost running. The trees all looked the same and panic set in. I wasn't sure I was on the same path anymore. I checked the sun, tried to keep it to my left, but the forest twisted everything. Then I saw him. Far ahead, between the trees, a figure. Thin, tall, his skin pale against the dark woods. He was standing still, watching me. He wasn't wearing shoes. I froze, my whole body rigid. He didn't move. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew he was looking at me. I turned and ran, crashing through branches, my backpack snagging, my breath ragged. I didn't stop until my chest felt like it would burst. When I finally dared to look back, he was gone. I pushed on, desperate to find the road. My mind was spinning, every thought screaming at me to keep moving. The forest seemed endless. My legs felt weak, my lips dry. The sun was dropping again, shadows stretching long. At last, I heard it, the faint sound of cars, far away. I followed the noise, stumbling, clawing through bushes until I broke through onto gravel. A narrow road, empty but real. I collapsed on the side, gasping. My whole body trembled with relief and fear. I sat there for a long time, waiting, afraid to go back, afraid he might appear on the edge of the trees. Eventually, a car came. I waved it down, desperate, and the driver slowed, staring at me with wide eyes. I must have looked wild, filthy, shaking. I didn't explain much, just asked for a ride back to town. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the barefoot prints, the missing knife, the disturbed ground, the pale figure in the trees. I knew what I had seen, what I had almost stumbled into. It was no ghost story, no imagination. It was a man living out there, watching, taking, maybe worse. I never went camping alone again. Even now, years later, I still dream of those bare footprints circling my tent in the dark. I don't even know why I decided to go camping that weekend. There wasn't any real plan behind it. It was one of those random urges you get when you feel tired of the noise around you and you just want to be away from everything for a while. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and sitting in front of screens all day. My head felt heavy, my chest tight, and I kept thinking that maybe I needed some kind of reset. I remembered the old camping gear I had stored in my closet, covered in dust. I hadn't used it in years. That Friday morning, I woke up with no set plan, just this thought that I should leave. I threw clothes into a backpack without checking properly. I shoved in a flashlight, some food, a sleeping bag, a small tent, and a cheap camping stove that I hadn't used since college. Everything felt rushed, but at the same time, it felt like the right thing to do. I didn't even check the weather forecast or tell anyone where I was going. I just picked a direction on the map, somewhere with forested land about 2 hours away, and drove. The drive felt freeing. The road stretched long and empty. The air became fresher the farther I got from the city, and the noise of cars and people thinned out until it was just the sound of my tires on asphalt. The closer I got to the forest, the smaller the road became, until it was only a narrow gravel path cutting through trees. There weren't any other cars. By the time I reached the small parking lot at the edge of the trail, I felt like I was already deep in a place where no one would bother me. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and locked my car. The forest swallowed me almost immediately. Tall pine trees pressed close together, their branches bending over the path and blocking the sky. The air smelled damp and earthy, and every step I took made the sound of dry twigs cracking under my boots. There were no voices, no movement except for the occasional flicker of a bird darting between branches. I felt calm at first, like I had made the right choice to be here. The trail wasn't marked very well. The sign at the start had been old and faded, with some letters scratched out. I walked for maybe an hour, following what looked like a path, though sometimes it disappeared under fallen leaves and I had to guess where it picked up again. I wasn't really worried. My plan was simple: find a spot, set up camp, spend a night or two, and then head back. After climbing a small ridge, I found a clearing. It was wide, flat, and surrounded by trees on all sides. A fallen log stretched across one edge of the clearing, covered in moss. The ground was dry, and there was enough open space that I could see the sky clearly. It looked like the perfect place to set up. I dropped my pack and started working. The tent poles gave me trouble at first since I hadn't set one up in years, but after a few minutes of fumbling, the tent stood upright. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, then stacked my food and water at one side. I lit the small camping stove and boiled some noodles I had brought. The smell of warm food filled the air and made me realize how hungry I was. I ate slowly, watching the sky change color as the sun lowered behind the trees. When night came, it came fast. One moment there was still light filtering through the branches, and the next it was gone. Darkness spread over the clearing, thick and heavy. The forest grew louder in the dark. I heard the constant hum of insects, the rustling of leaves as small animals moved through them, and the occasional crack of something heavier snapping a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I tried not to think about it too much. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and turned on my flashlight. The beam lit up the thin fabric walls, but outside of that circle of light, there was only blackness. I lay down, listening to the sounds, telling myself it was normal. Forests are alive at night. Animals move. Trees creak. I tried to relax, but then I heard something different. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, crunching the ground in a rhythm that was too heavy to be a small animal. They came from somewhere off to the left side of my tent. My whole body froze. I held my breath, waiting. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I told myself it could be a deer, maybe even a bear, but the sound wasn't right. Bears move with a kind of uneven weight, shuffling and snapping branches without care. These steps sounded careful, like someone putting one foot down after the other, pausing between them. I turned off my flashlight and laid flat, hoping the dark fabric of the tent would make me invisible. My heart pounded so hard I thought the sound of it would give me away. The footsteps circled slowly, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. Then they stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I could feel the hair on my arms standing straight up. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. I don't know. Eventually, I didn't hear anything anymore. My throat was dry, and my muscles ached from lying so stiff. I kept waiting for another sound, but the forest returned to the normal rhythm of insects and wind. I must have drifted off at some point, but when I opened my eyes again, it was early morning. The tent was damp with dew, and pale light leaked through the fabric. I unzipped the flap slowly and looked outside. The clearing looked normal. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed the ground. There were footprints in the dirt. Not animal prints. Shoes. They circled the tent and then disappeared back into the trees. I felt a wave of cold run through me. Someone had been there, watching me, walking around my tent in the dark. I thought about packing up immediately and leaving, but I told myself it was probably just some hiker passing through. Maybe they got curious. I tried to convince myself of that, though it didn't explain why they walked around me in circles. Still, I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want to feel like I was running away. Maybe because I had driven all the way out here and didn't want to waste it. So I forced myself to go about the day as if nothing happened. I spent the morning collecting firewood. Even though I hadn't planned on making a fire, the act of stacking logs made me feel better. I ate some jerky, walked a little farther down the ridge to see the view, and then came back to camp. The forest looked endless from up there, stretching out in all directions, thick with trees and valleys. It made me realize how far I was from anyone else. As the day went on, I noticed small things that didn't sit right. A broken branch that looked fresh, hanging at eye level where someone might have grabbed it. A cigarette but half buried near the clearing. I hadn't seen it when I first arrived, but it looked new, not old. When night came again, I felt tense. I didn't want to go back into the tent, but I also didn't want to sit out in the open. I lit a small fire in the pit I had made earlier and sat beside it, listening to the sounds. The fire gave me some comfort. I watched the flames rise and fall, trying to keep my mind blank. But after an hour or so, I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't circle. They stopped just beyond the light of the fire. I stared into the dark, straining my eyes, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. The fire cracked. My own breath felt loud, but whoever was out there stayed still, just standing, watching. I wanted to yell, but my throat locked up. I wanted to run, but where would I go? My car was far down the trail. The forest was too dark to move quickly without a light. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. The footsteps moved back into the woods. Slowly, calmly. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the fire until it burned down to coals, then sat in the dark with my flashlight clutched in my hand, waiting for morning. Every crack of a branch made me jump. When the sun finally rose, I made my decision. I packed everything fast, stuffing the tent and bag without caring how they fit. My only thought was leaving. I threw the pack over my shoulder and started down the trail toward my car. The forest felt different in daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few steps I glanced behind me, sure I'd see someone following. I walked faster, then faster still until I was nearly jogging. When I finally reached the parking lot, my chest loosened. My car was still there. I tossed my pack in the back, slammed the door shut, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing hard. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the driver's side window, smeared faintly across the glass, was the outline of a hand. A dirty, greasy handprint. I hadn't touched that window since leaving the city. Someone had been there, maybe last night, maybe while I was still in the woods. I started the engine and drove without looking back. The random trip I thought would clear my head left me with something else entirely. Even now, weeks later, I keep checking my windows before I go to bed, listening for footsteps at night. I keep thinking about that clearing, about how far I was from anyone else, and about the fact that whoever was out there never said a word. They didn't need to, they just watched, and that was enough. I always liked the idea of being alone in the woods, away from people, away from the sound of cars, away from the endless noise of the world. That's why, one late summer, I packed up my small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a water filter, a headlamp, and my backpack, and decided I would spend a few nights by myself in a quiet patch of forest that was about 3 hours away from the nearest town. I wanted to clear my head, breathe fresh air, and get some rest from the constant pressure of work. The drive itself was long, hot, and a little tiring, but once I left the pavement and started on the dirt road that cut into the trees, I felt that strange mix of excitement and calm that only comes when you know you're going somewhere far away from everyone. The forest there was thick. Pines, oaks and maples, all tangled together, with the ground covered in layers of dry leaves, ferns, and rocks. It wasn't an official campsite. There were no marked trails, no picnic tables, no fire rings. It was just raw woods, the kind where you have to make your own spot and be careful because no one's around to help you if something goes wrong. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked my car on a wider patch of the dirt road, far enough off to the side so no one would block me in. Then I loaded everything I needed on my back and started hiking deeper into the forest. The silence was heavy except for the sound of my boots crushing twigs and the occasional bird calling in the distance. I hiked for about 45 minutes before I found a spot that felt right. A small clearing with flat ground, surrounded by trees but not too crowded. From there, I could see a faint trickle of water down a slope, probably part of a creek, which was perfect for filtering water. I set up camp. First the tent, then I spread my sleeping bag inside. I stacked some fallen wood near the center for a small fire later, though I kept in mind the risk of fire spreading. I ate a quick meal of jerky and crackers and washed it down with filtered water from the creek. Everything was calm. That first evening, the forest seemed welcoming, the air cool but not cold, the sky slowly fading to orange before the darkness came in heavy and thick. When night fell, I lit the fire, just a small one, enough to cook a simple meal and give me some light. The woods around me turned into black walls with little sound. Only the occasional snap of branches in the distance, which I told myself was just deer moving around. I sat there for hours, staring into the fire, letting the silence sink in. I felt safe. When the fire burned down to embers, I put it out completely, then crawled into the tent. The first night, nothing happened. I slept a little rough, waking up at random hours because of the unfamiliar sounds. Owls, something scratching bark, leaves rustling, but eventually I got enough rest. The second day, I spent some time exploring. I followed the creek upstream, found a few animal tracks in the mud, maybe raccoon or coyote, but nothing that worried me. I took pictures, walked slowly, tried to enjoy being disconnected. The forest was beautiful, but also endless, like a maze of trunks and shadows. By the time the sun started sinking again, I was back at camp. I cooked a small meal over the fire, ate slowly, and felt good about the trip so far. But that night things felt different. When the fire was out and I was in my tent, I kept hearing movement in the woods. Not the quick darting of squirrels or the cautious steps of a deer. This was heavier, slower, twigs snapping under weight. I laid still in my sleeping bag, my heart starting to beat a little faster, trying to convince myself it was just an animal passing through. I didn't want to open the tent or shine a light. I thought if I stayed quiet, whatever it was would just move on. But it didn't. The sound circled the edge of the clearing, pausing every so often. I strained my ears, barely breathing, waiting. Then it was gone. Just silence again. I don't know how long I stayed awake after that, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and walked the edge of the clearing. The leaves and dirt were disturbed. At first it looked like just animal tracks, but some of the prints looked odd. Not clear enough to know for sure, but not the shape of a deer's hoof or a raccoon's paw either. More like boots, though faint. I told myself it was probably old, maybe from hunters who had passed through months ago. Still, the unease stuck with me. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I gathered extra firewood, filtered more water, and kept scanning the trees while I worked. It was quiet again, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The forest was so vast that anyone could be in it and you'd never know. By nightfall, I had a bigger fire going. I sat close to it, my headlamp strapped to my forehead but turned off to save battery. I ate slowly, listening. The forest pressed in around me, endless black between the trees. When I finally put the fire out and lay down inside the tent, I told myself I was being paranoid. Then came the sound again. This time it was closer. Snapping branches, slow steps, circling the clearing like before. I laid frozen, my ears straining, my body tense. My heart thudded so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The steps came closer, leaves crunching under weight. I could picture someone or something standing just outside the thin fabric of the tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound paused, then drifted away again, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. Not at all. In the morning, I checked again. More disturbed leaves, more faint shapes in the dirt. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was watching. I thought about packing up and leaving, but something in me said to stay. Maybe stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe just wanting to prove to myself I wasn't scared. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear. I stayed close to camp all day, collecting firewood, sharpening a stick into a crude spear, just in case. That night, the sounds started again. Only this time, I heard breathing. Slow, deep, human breathing, right outside the tent. I lay there stiff as stone, gripping the handle of the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. My throat felt tight. Every hair on my body stood up. The breathing lasted for what felt like forever. Then footsteps moved away into the woods again. I didn't wait for morning. I packed my bag in the dark, my hands shaking, stuffing everything in without care. I doused the fire pit, grabbed my pack, and started hiking toward the road with my headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the trees. My legs felt weak, but I forced them to move fast. The forest was alive with sound. Twigs snapping, footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept moving. The trail I had made earlier was faint in the night, and I nearly lost it several times. My headlamp flickered once, and my stomach dropped, but it held. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the dirt road. My car was still there, covered in dust. I threw my pack inside, started the engine, and drove as fast as I could, the headlights cutting through the trees until finally I hit pavement and the forest fell behind me. I never went back. Even now, thinking about it, I don't know for sure if it was a person or some kind of animal. But I know what I heard. The weight of the steps, the slow circle around my camp, the breathing. It wasn't the forest that scared me. It was knowing that someone else was out there, watching me, walking around my tent in the dark, waiting, and I will never forget that sound. I had not planned that camping trip for long. It was something that came to me one weekend when I felt like I needed to get away from my normal life for a while. Everything had been the same for too long. The same streets, the same people, the same noise of traffic outside my window at night. I wanted quiet, real quiet, the kind that only comes when you are far away from towns and phones and people. I did not even pick a real location ahead of time. I just loaded up my car with my tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooler of food, and some basic supplies. My plan was to drive out past the towns I usually knew, into the national forest land where camping was allowed, and just find a random spot that looked right. It was midsummer and the heat during the day was sharp, but I thought it would be fine. I liked the idea of being uncomfortable in nature, sweating and hiking, drinking warm water from my bottle, and just feeling that kind of tiredness that comes from doing something real instead of staring at screens all day. I did not think much about safety, other than bringing a knife, a flashlight, and some matches. I was not thinking of anything bad happening. I had done shorter trips before, but always in campgrounds where there were at least a few other tents around. This time, I wanted complete isolation. I drove for hours until the paved road turned into gravel, and the gravel eventually faded into dirt. The sun was bright, and dust followed my car like a long ghost trail that hung in the still air. On both sides of me were endless trees, thick with green, heavy branches bending slightly in the hot air. After about 30 more minutes of slow driving, I pulled off into a clearing that seemed flat enough. It was nothing special, just an open patch of grass surrounded by trees, but it felt far away enough. I killed the engine and listened. At first, the ringing silence made my ears hum. Then the forest sounds slowly came alive, the high buzzing of insects, a few sharp bird calls, and the distant rustle of leaves. There was no traffic, no people, no voices. Felt perfect. I set up my tent quickly, hammering the stakes into the ground and pulling the rainfly tight. Sweat rolled down my back, and I drank water between each task. After that, I gathered wood and built a small fire pit using stones from the edge of the clearing. Took me longer than I expected, but by late afternoon I had the camp looking decent. I sat on a log, ate a sandwich I had packed, and just let myself relax. The forest around me was endless. I could see maybe 20 feet into the trees before the green shadows swallowed everything. Every now and then the wind moved through, and the leaves rippled in waves like water. I thought about how far I must have been from the nearest person. My phone had no signal. That thought gave me a strange mix of comfort and unease. As the sun dropped lower, the shadows grew longer, stretching across my little clearing until the grass was cut with strips of fading light. I felt a calm, but it was not the same kind of calm you feel at home. It was heavier, like the weight of the trees pressing in. I sat by the fire and waited for night. When darkness came, it came fast. The forest seemed to suck the last bits of light out of the sky. The fire was my only shield against the blackness that poured in from every side. The sounds of the woods changed too. Birds went quiet, and instead I heard crickets and something else. Something moving through the brush, soft and steady. I told myself it was just animals. A raccoon, maybe a deer. Nothing strange. But every time I looked out into the dark, I could not see anything. I forced myself to focus on the fire. The flames popped and hissed, and the smoke rose straight up into the still air. I roasted a small piece of meat over the fire on a stick, chewing slowly, listening. I noticed how sharp my hearing felt out there. Every little snap of a twig made my body stiffen. I kept telling myself it was fine. It was the woods. It was always like this. But the unease did not leave me. That first night, when I finally crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, I thought I would sleep easy. But it was different lying there in the dark. The nylon walls of the tent felt paper thin, and every sound outside felt closer than it should have been. I could hear the crickets, the wind, and underneath that something heavier. Something like slow steps pressing down on the dry grass. I held still, my ears straining. The sound would stop, then start again. Faint but there. Not close enough to be right at my tent, but close enough that I knew it was not my imagination. I thought about unzipping the flap and shining my flashlight, but something deep inside me told me not to. Instead, I lay there in the dark, clutching my knife in my hand, waiting for the noise to fade. Eventually, maybe an hour later, it did. Sleep finally came in broken pieces. Every time I drifted off, I jerked awake at some sound. By morning, my eyes felt heavy, but I was glad to see light again. The second day, I told myself the night had been nothing, just animals. I forced myself to believe it. I spent the morning exploring a little. I walked into the woods in one direction for about half a mile, marking trees with a knife so I would not get lost. The forest felt endless, the air thick and heavy, insects buzzing around my ears. I found nothing unusual, just trees, brush, a few fallen logs, and the occasional sign of deer tracks in the dirt. When I returned to camp, I noticed something strange. One of the stones from my fire pit was moved. At first, I thought maybe I had kicked it without realizing, but it was not just moved a little, it was pulled several feet away. It sat out of place, like it had been lifted and dropped. I stared at it for a while, confused. Stones don't just move. Maybe an animal? But what kind of animal drags a stone? I pushed the thought away, rebuilt the pit, and kept myself busy through the day. I collected more wood, filled my bottles at a small stream I found, and cooked a simple meal. The whole time, though, I felt watched. Every time I stepped into the tree line, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. That second night, the unease grew worse. I sat by the fire longer, not wanting to crawl into the tent. The woods were loud with crickets and frogs, but underneath that was something else again. A soft crunching, like footsteps circling the clearing. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and listened. The sound came from one side, then silence, then from another. I whipped my light into the trees, but the beam only cut a narrow slice of blackness. Nothing was there, or at least nothing I could see. When I finally lay down in the tent, I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, but just like the night before, I heard it again. Slow steps pressing the ground, moving in patterns that no deer or raccoon would. I barely slept. By the third morning, I felt exhausted. My nerves were shot, and every sound set me on edge. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I also felt stubborn. I had come here for peace, for a break, and I did not want to run back to the noise of town just because of shadows and sounds. But that morning, when I stepped out of the tent, I froze. Right there in the dirt, not 10 feet from where I slept, were tracks. Human tracks, bare feet. The prints were clear, pressed into the dry ground, circling my tent once before fading into the trees. My stomach turned cold. Someone had been out there in the night, not an animal, person. I stood there staring for a long time. I tried to think of reasons. Maybe a hiker who had wandered close, but barefoot, in the middle of the night, circling my camp? It made no sense. The day dragged. I kept looking over my shoulder, every crack of a branch making me jump. I carried my knife everywhere, even when I went to fill water. I barely ate. That night I built the fire bigger, stacking more wood, letting the flames roar higher. I sat as close as I could, the heat burning my skin, because I knew what waited in the dark. The footsteps came earlier this time, slow, deliberate, circling just out of sight. My chest pounded, and sweat soaked my shirt even though the night air was cool. I wanted to shout, to tell whoever it was to stop, but my throat locked. Then I heard it, the sound of something brushing against my tent fabric, just for a second, then pulling away. I gripped my knife so tight my hand ached. I sat frozen, staring at the glowing fabric of the tent with the firelight outside casting faint orange shapes. The hours crawled. At some point, exhaustion took me again, though I fought it. When dawn came, I stepped out and checked. The tracks were back, fresh, more of them this time. Whoever it was had walked closer, circling tighter around my tent. That was enough. I started packing immediately. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag, tore down the tent, and threw everything into the car. I did not care how messy it was. I just needed to go. But when I turned the key, the car only clicked. The battery was dead. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, panic rising. I had no signal, no way to call for help, and miles of forest between me and the main road. The only option was to hike out. I slung my pack on my shoulders, grabbed my knife, I always thought camping alone would be peaceful. I imagined the quiet, the fresh air, the break from noise and people. I had done plenty of trips before with friends, but this time I wanted to test myself and see if I could handle it alone. That was the mistake that turned a simple trip into something I still can't stop thinking about. The day started simple. I packed light, just a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, some food, and the usual survival gear. I drove for hours until the paved road turned to gravel, then dirt until I finally reached the trailhead. The forest stretched endlessly, thick pine trees standing like walls on both sides. The air was cooler up there, crisp and sharp in my lungs. I signed the trail register at the start, just my name and the date, then slipped the pen back into the box. The dirt trail swallowed me, and soon I felt like I was walking into another world. The first few hours were perfect. I walked with the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders, the crunch of gravel and dirt under my boots, birds darting between the branches. I didn't see another soul on the trail, which I thought was a blessing at the time. I wanted solitude, and I got it. Around mid-afternoon, I found a clearing beside a small creek. It seemed like the right place to set up camp. The grass was soft, the sound of running water steady, and the clearing gave me a decent view of the treeline on all sides. That felt important. I liked being able to see what was around me. I pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and started boiling water for dinner. The simple motions calmed me. Everything felt normal, routine. I ate, washed the pot in the creek, and sat back to watch the sun lower itself behind the trees. The light dimmed slowly, the forest changing from green and gold to gray and black. I had always liked how the woods felt at dusk, like the whole world was holding its breath. But this time, there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't shake. When the dark came, it came fast. The forest swallowed the last light, and the air grew colder. I lit my lantern and hung it inside the tent, the thin fabric glowing faintly. The noises outside changed with the dark. The cheerful chirping of birds was gone, replaced by the high, sharp calls of insects and the occasional snap of a twig that seemed louder than it should have been. Every sound felt close, too close, like it was right at the edge of the clearing. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to rest, but my ears kept picking out noises. A branch cracked, something brushed through the grass, water trickled in the creek, but even that seemed heavier somehow, like footsteps slipping through shallow water. I told myself it was just animals. It had to be. Out here, deer, raccoons, even bears weren't unusual. That was normal, but normal didn't make it easier to ignore. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep, that thin layer where dreams and reality blur together. I don't know how long I stayed there before something jerked me awake. It wasn't a sound this time. It was silence. The insects had stopped. The forest that had been alive with noise only minutes earlier was now completely still. That kind of silence is the loudest thing you'll ever hear. I lay there, heart pounding, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. My hand slid to the flashlight beside me, and I gripped it so tight my knuckles ached. I waited, every muscle tense, listening. Then it came, slow, deliberate crunches on the ground outside. Heavy, measured steps, not the quick scurry of an animal. Something was moving at the edge of my camp. I held my breath, trying to count the steps. 1, 2, 3. They stopped. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the forest shifting. But then I heard the faint scrape of something against fabric. My tent. My skin went cold. I didn't move. Couldn't. The sound of fingers or claws or something slid down the side of the tent. Then it stopped. I wanted to burst out, shine my light, yell, anything, but I stayed frozen, waiting. Minutes dragged on, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Eventually, the steps moved again, circling, slow, like someone pacing just outside. Then nothing. I must have passed out at some point because when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was streaming into the tent. Morning. I scrambled out, legs shaking, scanning the clearing. Nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything out of place. Just the creek, the trees, and the dew on the grass. For a second, I thought maybe it had been a dream, one of those vivid half-dreams that latch onto real sounds. But when I walked to the side of the tent, I saw it. 2 long smears down the fabric, faint but there, like someone had dragged their fingers slowly across the surface. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but pride kept me there. I told myself I was overreacting, that the marks could have been anything, branches maybe, or me brushing against it last night. I forced myself to push the fear down, made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to hike a little deeper into the woods for the day. The hike didn't help. Every sound behind me felt like footsteps. Every shadow between the trees made me snap my head around. I found myself constantly checking the trail behind me, half expecting to see someone following. The deeper I went, the worse it got. By afternoon, I turned back, telling myself I just wanted to relax at camp. When I stepped back into the clearing, my stomach dropped. The tent had been moved. Not far, maybe a foot or two, but enough. I had staked it firmly into the ground. Wind couldn't have done that. Animals couldn't have done that. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, my pack still strapped to my shoulders, sweat dripping down my back. The creek gurgled as if nothing was wrong, but the air felt heavier, thicker. I walked slowly to the tent and checked inside. Nothing was missing. My sleeping bag was where I'd left it, my lantern, my food. Everything was untouched except the tent itself. That night was worse. I didn't sleep. I lay there, flashlight in hand, listening. The sounds came again. Slow steps, circling, pausing, scraping. At one point I swore I heard breathing, low and steady, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I gripped the flashlight so hard my hand cramped. Every time I thought about unzipping the tent and shining the beam out, I imagined what I might see. That thought kept me frozen. Hours passed like that, me staring at the ceiling, ears straining, every muscle locked. Sometime before dawn, the noises stopped again, leaving me in silence. When daylight came, I stumbled out, body trembling from exhaustion. The clearing looked the same as before, but this time I didn't hesitate. I started packing. I couldn't stay another night, but when I reached for my pack, I froze. It wasn't where I'd left it. I had set it beside the tent, against a log. Now it was leaning on the opposite side, closer to the trees. I checked it quickly. Everything was still inside, but someone had moved it. I strapped it on and started down the trail, walking fast, eyes darting to every shadow. The forest that had felt peaceful 2 days earlier now felt like a trap. The trees pressing in, the trail stretching longer than it should have. I kept glancing behind me, certain I would see someone, but the trail stayed empty. Hours later, I reached the trailhead, legs aching, throat dry. My car sat where I'd left it, a silent relief. But as I dropped my pack into the trunk, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. A smear of mud on the driver's side door. Not from my hands. I had washed the car before leaving, and the smear was fresh, wet, as if someone had touched it recently. I didn't wait to think about it. I got in, locked the doors, and drove, gravel spitting under the tires until I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, surrounded by people and noise. It's been months since then, but I still can't shake it. I keep replaying the nights, the steps, the scraping, the way my tent had been moved, my pack shifted, the smear on my car. I'll never know if it was someone living out there, watching, waiting, or just a stranger who happened to pass by and decided to play with me. I only know one thing: I'll never camp alone again. I never really thought much about camping alone until the day I decided to do it for the first time. Most of the time when I went into the woods, it was with a group of friends or family, and I always had that safety net of knowing other people were around me. But something about being alone, testing myself against the silence and the wilderness, pulled at me. It wasn't a smart decision looking back because I didn't prepare the way I should have. I just grabbed my pack, threw in what I thought was enough food and water, brought my tent, a knife, and a flashlight, and drove out to a trail I had never explored before. It wasn't even a marked campsite, just a stretch of forest where I knew I could set up without being bothered. The sky was overcast when I parked the car on the side of a dirt road, locked it, and walked in. The trees were tall and close together, the ground damp from rain earlier in the week. My boots sank a little into the mud with each step, and I could feel the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. I didn't have a map, just a general sense of where I was going. I told myself I would follow the slope of the land, stick near the creek that I could hear running faintly in the distance, and eventually circle back. The forest had that thick smell of wet earth and leaves, mixed with pine and moss. Every so often a bird called out, but most of the time it was quiet except for my own movement. After about an hour of walking, I found a clearing that looked good enough to set up in. It was slightly elevated, dry compared to the lower ground, and had enough space between trees to pitch my tent. I dropped my pack, stretched my shoulders, and felt the relief of getting that weight off my back. I spent a while gathering sticks for firewood, stacking them near where I'd build the fire ring. I pitched my tent, which wasn't too hard since it was a small 2-person tent I'd used before. By the time I finished setting up, the sun had already started sinking behind the trees. The light came down in streaks through the branches, making the woods look darker than they actually were. The shadows stretched out long, and that familiar creeping feeling came with them, the way the forest seemed to change personality once the sun started dropping. I ate a quick meal of jerky and trail mix while I sat by the little fire I built. The flames flickered and cracked, pushing back the dark. The warmth on my face felt good, but the air was cool on my back, and every time I looked over my shoulder into the black spaces between trees, I felt exposed. There's a strange thing about being alone in the woods. During the day, it feels like freedom, but at night, it feels like you're out of place, like you're intruding on something that doesn't belong to you. The noises started once the forest went fully dark. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, the kind of sounds you tell yourself are small animals, harmless, just moving around. I tried to believe that, but every now and then something sounded too heavy, too deliberate. My fire wasn't big, just enough to keep me warm and give me light. I kept throwing sticks on it almost obsessively because I didn't want it to die down. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire smoldering low. I lay there listening to the night. The nylon walls of the tent felt thin, like paper. Every sound outside came through clearly. The breeze in the trees, the distant rush of the creek, the occasional sharp crack of a branch. I told myself over and over that I was safe, that there was nothing to be afraid of, but my body didn't believe it. My chest felt tight, and every little noise jolted me awake again. Somewhere deep into the night, I heard something that froze me completely. It wasn't the usual scattering of animals or rustling leaves. It was footsteps, slow, steady, on the wet ground just outside my tent. They circled once, paused, then shifted again. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't dare grab it because the sound of the switch would give me away. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was worse. I waited, straining my ears, heart pounding so loud I swore whoever was out there could hear it. I don't know how long I lay like that, maybe an hour, maybe just minutes, until exhaustion won and I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. When I woke, the sun was up and the forest looked normal again, almost welcoming. But I stepped outside the tent and saw the ground around it. In the mud, there were boot prints, not mine. They were larger, spaced out like someone had been walking slowly around where I slept. My stomach turned to ice. I looked around the clearing, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. The fire had gone out completely. My first thought was to pack up and leave immediately, but a part of me argued that maybe it had just been a hiker passing through, maybe they didn't mean anything. I convinced myself of that because the alternative was worse. I stayed another night, but I moved my tent deeper into the woods, closer to the creek. I thought being near running water would mask some of the noise and maybe keep me calmer. I tried to set up differently to make it less obvious I was there. I ate quickly, kept my fire small, and went into the tent early. Again, in the middle of the night, I heard movement. This time, it wasn't just walking. It was the sound of something brushing against fabric. My tent shook lightly, just once, like someone had dragged their hand along it. My whole body locked. The urge to scream built in my chest, but I kept it down. I gripped the knife I had brought and held it close, but I knew it was useless if someone really wanted to come inside. Hours stretched on. The sound faded eventually, but I never slept again that night. By morning, I was shaking with exhaustion and fear. When I unzipped the tent, I saw something that made my stomach twist even worse. On the zipper of the tent door, tied in a small knot, was a piece of string. I hadn't put it there. Someone had been close enough, quiet enough, to tie it while I was inside. That was it for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving things carelessly into my bag. I didn't care about organizing, I just wanted out. The woods felt different now, hostile, like the trees themselves were hiding someone watching me. Every step back toward where I thought the road was felt like being hunted. I walked for hours, but I must have gone the wrong direction because I never found the dirt road. Panic set in as the sun climbed higher. I kept moving, following the creek, hoping it would lead me back to something familiar. My legs burned. My shoulders screamed under the weight of the pack, and every sound made me whip my head around. Eventually, I came across another clearing. This one wasn't empty. There was a small fire pit, cold but clearly used recently. Beside it were footprints, the same size as the ones I had seen outside my tent. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been around me at night had been camping here. I wasn't imagining it. That was when I dropped the idea of finding the road directly. I decided to follow the creek downstream, no matter how long it took, because water usually led to people. My body was running on fear more than anything else at that point. I stumbled, scraped my legs on rocks, cut my hands pushing through brush, but I didn't stop. It wasn't until the evening of that same day that I finally saw something that made me feel safe again. Through the trees, I spotted a stretch of open ground and the glint of metal, a fence. Beyond it, a dirt path wide enough for vehicles. I almost cried when I saw it. I pushed through the last of the branches and climbed over, ripping my pants on the wire but not caring. The dirt road stretched out in both directions, and after walking for what felt like forever, I finally saw my car where I had left it. The sight of it sitting there in the fading light was the greatest relief I had ever felt. I threw my pack into the back seat, climbed inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble starting the engine. When I finally drove away, the forest receding in the rearview mirror, I made myself a promise. I would never camp alone again. It wasn't worth it. The woods were beautiful, yes, but they were also full of things you couldn't control. It wasn't animals that had scared me out of there. It was another person, someone who had walked around my tent in the night, tied string to my zipper, and left me wondering what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. That thought has stayed with me ever since. Not the silence of the forest, not the weight of the trees, but the feeling of someone out there in the dark, watching me while I slept, waiting for something I'm glad I never gave them the chance to take. I had been waiting for weeks to get some time away from the noise of the city. My job had been eating me alive, and I felt like I couldn't even breathe properly anymore. I wanted space, silence, the kind of quiet you only get when you're deep in the woods. I picked a spot I had never been before, somewhere far enough that I wouldn't hear cars, far enough that I wouldn't see any houses or people, but close enough to reach before dark if I started early. I packed light but enough to stay a couple of nights. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, small stove, flashlight, and a knife that I always carried whenever I went outdoors. The trail I chose wasn't popular. That was exactly what I wanted. Most people I knew would choose the crowded campsites with picnic tables and bathrooms, but that wasn't camping to me. I wanted to be where I had to filter my own water, where the night sky actually looked like a blanket of stars, where I had to depend on myself. I knew it was riskier, but I had some experience and I felt ready. When I got there, the trailhead was completely empty. My car was the only one in the small dirt lot. I strapped my pack on and started walking. The first hour was simple enough. Pine trees on both sides, the smell of damp earth, the occasional sound of a bird flying off when I got too close. My boots crunched over dry leaves and small rocks. The further I went, the quieter it became. The sound of the highway faded until it was just me, the forest, and the rhythm of my breathing. I had a map printed out from home and a compass hanging around my neck. I knew where the creek was supposed to be, and my plan was to set up camp somewhere near it so I'd have water close by. The air grew cooler as I went deeper, and the trees grew taller, shutting out more of the sky. At one point, I realized how thick the silence was. There weren't even birds anymore, just the sound of me moving. It was around mid-afternoon when I reached the creek. It wasn't very big, just a narrow stream running over smooth stones, but the water looked clear. I followed it a bit until I found a flat clearing just big enough for my tent. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there was a large fallen log nearby that I could use as a seat. I dropped my pack and started setting up camp. Pitching the tent was routine. I staked it down, unrolled my sleeping bag, and set my pack inside. After that, I collected some wood for a fire, though I didn't light it yet. I ate a quick snack, then walked to the creek to fill my water bottle. I had a filter with me, so I knelt down and started pumping water through it. That was when I noticed something strange. Across the creek, in the dirt, there were prints. At first, I thought they were deer tracks, but when I looked closer, they were too wide, too flat. They almost looked like boot prints. The tread pattern was faint, but there. My first thought was that someone had come through here before me, maybe earlier that morning or the day before. But the thing was, they looked fresh. The edges hadn't crumbled, and the ground was still damp. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe another hiker had passed through and just didn't park at the trailhead I used. I tried to push it out of my mind, but I kept glancing across the creek while I filtered water. I felt exposed kneeling there, like eyes were on me. I carried the bottle back to camp and tried to shake it off. By evening, I had a small fire going. The flames snapped and hissed as they caught, throwing just enough warmth to keep the chill away. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove and ate while sitting on the log. The woods were darkening fast. The forest seemed to close in tighter once the sun dipped. I kept listening for sounds, branches breaking, footsteps, anything, but it was just quiet, too quiet. I crawled into my tent when it was fully dark. The fire had burned low, and I didn't bother feeding it more wood. I stretched out in my sleeping bag and listened to the faint trickle of the creek. First, it was peaceful. My eyes grew heavy, but then a noise woke me. It was faint, but clear enough. Something crunching on the ground outside. Slow, deliberate steps. Not an animal scurrying. Not a raccoon digging around. These were heavier. My heart started pounding in my chest. I held my breath, straining my ears. The steps came closer, then stopped. I stared at the thin fabric of the tent, barely lit by the dying glow of the fire outside. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. Someone was standing just beyond the tent. Minutes crawled by. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. My hand slowly slid toward the knife lying near my bag. The steps started again, this time moving around my tent, slow circles, crunching the pine needles. Whoever it was, they didn't say anything. They didn't make a sound except for walking. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I waited. My arm was stiff from holding the knife. My chest ached from the shallow breathing. Finally, I worked up the courage to move. I unzipped the tent just an inch, silently, peeking out. The fire was dead, just faint glowing coals. The clearing was pitch dark beyond that. I couldn't see anyone. I sat awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, flinching at every small sound. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under, but when I woke, it was to daylight and birds singing again. For a moment, I convinced myself I had imagined it, maybe dreamed it, but then I saw them, boot prints, clear as day, all around my tent. I felt sick. My mouth was dry, and my hands shook as I crawled out. They weren't mine. I could see the difference in tread. Someone had been here, circling me while I lay inside. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. No one. I should have packed up right then and left. Every instinct told me to, but part of me was stubborn. I had come all this way to escape, and I didn't want to run just because some stranger might have wandered too close. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter or some backpacker passing through. I forced myself to eat breakfast and tried to calm down, but the unease never left. That day, I hiked a bit along the creek, trying to enjoy myself. I kept checking over my shoulder, though, scanning the trees for movement. The whole time, I had the sense that someone was out there, just far enough that I couldn't see them. When I came back to camp in the afternoon, I knew for sure. My stuff had been touched. Nothing was stolen, but things weren't where I left them. My sleeping bag was unzipped, my food bag was shifted, and the flap of my tent was open halfway. I knew I had closed it that morning. Felt like my chest caved in. Someone had been here while I was gone. Not an animal. Person. I grabbed my pack and started shoving things inside. I wasn't staying another night. I planned to head back to the trailhead and sleep in my car if I had to. I could barely think straight as I tore down the tent, shoving poles and fabric into my bag without folding them. My hands shook the whole time. That was when I heard it. A whistle. It was faint, carried on the wind, but it froze me in place. Just a single, sharp note, somewhere in the trees behind me. I didn't move. My throat tightened, and sweat broke out across my back. Another whistle came, longer this time. Then silence. I grabbed my knife, stuffed it into my pocket, and yanked my pack onto my shoulders. I didn't even check if everything was inside. I just started walking. My boots hit the ground hard, faster and faster, until I was practically jogging. Every sound behind me made me whip my head around. The forest looked the same in every direction, endless trees, shadows between them. I kept waiting to see someone step out, but no one did. After what felt like an hour, I stopped to catch my breath. My heart hammered against my ribs, and my throat was raw from breathing so hard. I took a sip of water and tried to listen. First, it was just silence. Then, snap, a branch breaking, close. I didn't wait. I ran. My pack bounced on my shoulders, cutting into me, but I didn't stop. I crashed through brush, following the trail as best as I could. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I kept going. Finally, I saw it, the glint of my car through the trees. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I sprinted the last stretch, fumbling with my keys as I ran. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and slammed the locks down. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely start the engine. When it roared to life, I backed out of the dirt lot so fast my tires spit gravel. As I turned onto the road, I looked back once. At the tree line just beyond the lot, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing still, half hidden in the shadows. Watching, I didn't stop to be sure. I pressed the gas and didn't let off until miles separated me from that place. I never went back, and I never will. I had been planning a short camping trip for a few weeks. Nothing big, just a night or two out in the woods to clear my head. Life in the city had been getting too loud, too crowded, and I felt like I needed air that didn't taste like smoke and dust. I didn't go with friends, and not because I didn't have any who would have joined, but because I wanted to be alone this time. Just me, my pack, and the woods. I told myself it would be calm, peaceful, and simple. That was the plan. The morning I left, I checked my gear twice. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, knife, and a small camp stove. I wasn't going deep into the wilderness, just far enough that I wouldn't hear cars or see houses. I wanted that quiet where the only sound was wind in the trees and birds moving in the branches. I parked my car near the edge of a trail that was used more by hunters and fishermen than casual hikers, slung the pack on my shoulders, and started walking. The day was warm, late summer, but the air carried that first hint of autumn. The trail dipped and twisted through the trees, and the further I went, the less it looked like anyone had been there in weeks. I liked that. It felt like I was stepping into a place that belonged to itself, not to people. After a couple of hours, I found a spot that felt right. A small clearing, surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow stream running a few feet away. The sound of the water was soft, steady, and I knew it would be good company through the night. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and set up the tent. The ground was mostly flat, though covered in pine needles that cushioned it well. I made a small fire pit with some stones, collected dry sticks and branches, and soon had smoke curling upward. The air smelled of resin and wood, and I sat there for a long time just listening to the forest. As the light shifted and the shadows grew long, I ate a simple meal, just rice with some canned meat. I drank from my water bottle, refilled it from the stream after running it through my filter, and then sat watching the fire. I expected to feel relaxed, but there was a nervous edge in me that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was just being alone in the woods. Maybe it was the silence pressing in. Every little snap in the trees made my head turn. I told myself it was nothing, just animals, squirrels, maybe deer. Darkness came slowly, and I laid back against my pack, staring at the sky through the break in the trees. Stars appeared, sharp and cold. The fire burned lower, and the air cooled. I pulled my jacket tight and listened to the water running in the stream. That steady sound was what finally started to calm me. But sometime later, when I was half dozing by the fire, I heard something else. It was faint at first, like a rustle that didn't fit the wind. Then a crack, like a branch snapping under weight. My eyes opened, my whole body alert. I sat up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing moved. The woods looked the same, the shadows unchanged. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Another sound came, slower this time, but definitely there. Not close, but not far either. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer coming to drink from the stream. That happened all the time. Still, I picked up the flashlight and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but all I saw were trunks, needles, and undergrowth. No glowing eyes, no shape moving away. I lowered the light, sat back, and tried to let it go. But the sound didn't stop. It came and went, like someone or something was circling, always just far enough that I couldn't see. Too heavy for a rabbit or fox, too slow for a deer running. I felt my stomach tighten. My fire was smaller now, just glowing coals. I fed it more wood, watched the flames rise higher again, and kept my back to the tent so I could see as much of the clearing as possible. Time stretched. The night felt thicker, colder. Every few minutes, I thought I heard it again. Branches bending, weight on the ground, a faint splash in the stream. I didn't move from my spot. I gripped the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other, though I knew the knife wouldn't be much use against anything bigger than a raccoon. Hours must have passed like that. My eyes burned with tiredness, but I didn't want to close them. I didn't want to crawl into the tent and be blind to whatever was out there. The woods had gone strangely quiet too. No owls, no insects, just the fire crackling and the water running. That silence pressed on me harder than anything else. At some point, the sounds faded. I don't know when exactly, but I realized I hadn't heard anything in a while. My body ached from sitting stiff so long, and my eyelids felt like they weighed pounds. Against my better judgment, I finally crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and laid down. The fire outside was low again, but I told myself it was fine. The night was almost over. I would sleep, wake to sunlight, and laugh at myself for being so wound up. Sleep came in pieces, shallow and restless. My dreams were full of footsteps in the dark, shadows moving around me, whispers in the trees. I woke more than once, heart hammering, straining to hear. Each time, I thought I caught a faint sound outside the tent, but it was gone before I could be sure. When morning finally came, the light spilling through the thin tent walls, I sat up fast, groggy but alert. I unzipped the flap and looked out. Everything looked normal. Trees, fire pit, stream. The air was cool and sharp, the way it always is at dawn. I stepped out, stretched, and tried to shake off the unease. Then I saw the ground. Around the edges of the clearing, in the soft earth and pine needles, were prints. Not clear shoe prints, not boots like mine, but shapes that looked too flat, too wide. They circled the camp, came close to the fire, close to the tent. Some crossed over each other, like whoever or whatever had been out there had paced around for hours. My chest went tight as I stared. These weren't deer, weren't bear, and they weren't mine. I crouched, touched the ground, and felt how fresh they were. The soil was still pressed, the edges sharp. They hadn't been there the day before. Something had walked around me in the night, again and again, while I sat awake and later while I slept. My whole body shivered despite the morning sun. I packed fast, hands shaking, eyes scanning the trees. Every sound, every movement in the branches made me whip my head around. I doused the fire, stuffed the gear into my pack, and didn't bother with breakfast. I just needed to get out. The trail back felt twice as long. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone following. The woods that had felt peaceful yesterday now felt tight, watching, hostile. The prints stayed in my mind, circling me, standing just outside the firelight. When I finally broke through the trees and saw my car, I almost ran. I threw the pack in, slammed the door, and locked it. Sitting there behind the wheel, I breathed hard, hands gripping tight. Only then did I feel how exhausted I was, how close I'd been to panicking. I drove away without looking back. That night, safe in my apartment with city noise around me, I thought about the woods, about the sound of steps just out of sight, about the prints in the dirt circling my camp. Whoever it was had stayed just beyond the light, close enough to watch me, close enough to wait. They hadn't done anything else. Not yet, but they could have. I had gone out there for quiet, for peace, but what I found was something I still can't explain. Not a ghost, not a monster, just something real, human maybe, and worse because of it. Someone who watched, who came close in the dark and chose not to show themselves. And that's what stays with me even now, that I was never alone out there, not for a second. I never liked calling any of my trips random. I always planned them, even if people thought I just went out into the woods without much thought. But this time, I told myself it really was random. I had finished a long week at work, and I didn't want to stay home another weekend staring at the same walls, the same screens, the same routine. I wanted to get away, so I just stuffed my backpack with the usual things: tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, small stove, food, water bottles, a first aid kit, and a knife that had been in my camping gear for years. I didn't think much of it. I threw everything together, picked a spot on a map that I had never been to, and told myself I would just hike in, camp for a night, and come back. The place wasn't far from the main road, but it was still deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't hear traffic or see houses. I parked my car in a small gravel pull-off and started walking. The trail wasn't even marked, just an old logging path that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. Grass and weeds had pushed through cracks in the dirt. The air smelled damp, like it had rained the night before, and the ground felt soft under my boots. It wasn't uncomfortable at first, just a little sticky, and I kept thinking it would dry up once the sun rose higher. The walk-in wasn't long, maybe an hour or so. I took my time, letting the sounds of the forest surround me. Birds called out in short bursts, something rustled in the brush from time to time, and the wind moved lazily through the trees. Everything felt normal, and that gave me comfort. Nothing stood out. Nothing felt threatening. I found a clearing that looked flat enough for a tent and set down my pack. I could still hear the faint sound of water nearby, maybe a stream or creek, but it wasn't close enough to see. I thought that was perfect. Close enough for fresh water, but not so close that I'd be sleeping beside it. Setting up camp was easy. The tent went up without any problems, and I rolled out my sleeping bag inside. I unpacked a small amount of food jerky, some trail mix, and a can of beans. Nothing fancy, but it would get me through. I boiled some water on the stove, ate, and then decided to wander a little farther out before it got dark, just to see the area. I left the tent standing there, the only sign of me in that whole clearing. The woods were thick. The deeper I walked, the quieter it got. The birds grew more distant, the sounds of insects louder, and the air cooler. I kept glancing back, making sure I remembered the way. I didn't want to get lost. After about half an hour, I realized I had gone far enough. I turned back, retracing my steps carefully until I saw the light-colored nylon of my tent glowing faintly between the trees. Relief washed through me. By the time I sat back at camp, the sun was low. The light filtered through the trees at an angle, making the woods look more shadowed than they really were. I sat on a fallen log and just listened. It should have been peaceful, but for some reason, I couldn't relax. My skin felt prickly, like I was being watched. I told myself that was natural. Humans weren't meant to be out here alone. The mind plays tricks. As night came, the forest changed. The sounds that had filled the day faded, replaced by new ones. Crickets started their endless chorus. Something big moved in the brush at one point, maybe a deer, maybe something else. I froze, holding my breath until the noise faded. My fire was small, just enough to keep the darkness from pressing in too tightly, but it didn't feel like much. The shadows still crowded the edges of the clearing. I crawled into my tent after putting out the fire, zipped the door shut, and lay down in my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent felt paper-thin. Every sound outside came through clearly. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, the wind shifted. I tried to tell myself it was all normal, that the forest was alive and busy at night. But my chest felt tight, and I couldn't shake the thought that something was circling out there. I don't know how long I lay awake, staring at the fabric above me, waiting for sleep. At some point, I must have drifted off, but I woke again in the middle of the night. It was dead quiet. Not a single cricket, not a single rustle, just silence. And then slow, deliberate steps. They were close. Not an animal running or thrashing, not the quick scurry of a raccoon or fox. These were heavy, steady, careful. They moved just beyond my tent, circling. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my whole body go rigid. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip the sleeping bag. I just lay there, every nerve on fire. The steps paused near my head, so close I swore I could feel them in the ground. Then nothing. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. Couldn't tell. The silence pressed in harder than the darkness. Finally, after what felt like forever, the steps faded away into the woods. I didn't sleep again. I just lay there until the first light of morning started to creep through the tent walls. When it was bright enough, I finally unzipped the door and stepped out. The clearing looked the same as before. No broken branches, no footprints I could see, nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been out there. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but pride kept me in place. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a bear, maybe just a big deer. Nothing to be afraid of if I was careful. So I stayed. I boiled water for coffee, ate more jerky, and tried to convince myself the night had been nothing unusual. The day passed slowly. I walked a little, stayed near camp, tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every time the woods went quiet, I felt that same prickling on my skin. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder constantly. By the time the sun set again, I was already on edge. That night was worse. I lay in the tent, listening, waiting. The silence came again, sudden and heavy. Then the steps, same as before. Slow, careful, circling. Only this time, they didn't fade away. They stopped right at my tent. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, human breathing. I gripped the handle of my knife, my hand shaking so badly I thought I would drop it. I wanted to yell, to scare whoever it was away, but fear clamped my throat shut. I stayed silent, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound of fabric brushed against the tent wall. Something or someone dragged their hand along it, tracing slowly across the surface. I pressed back against the far side, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then it stopped. The breathing faded. The steps moved away one by one into the trees. I didn't wait for morning this time. I shoved my things into my pack in the dark, fumbling, frantic. My hands barely worked, but I forced myself to move quickly. I left the tent standing and just shouldered my bag. My only thought was to get back to the road, back to my car, back to anywhere but here. The trail felt different in the dark. Every tree looked the same. My flashlight shook in my hand as I tried to keep to the path. I kept hearing things behind me, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But every time I swung the light back, there was nothing. The walk stretched on forever. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I just kept moving, one step after another, until finally, I saw the faint glint of metal from my car through the trees. Relief almost dropped me to my knees. I reached the car, threw my bag in the back, and climbed inside. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the keys twice before starting the engine. As the headlights cut through the trees, I saw something just at the edge of the light. A figure, standing still, facing me. I didn't wait. I hit the gas and pulled onto the road, heart hammering so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't slow down until I was miles away. That was the last time I ever went camping alone. I had been planning the trip for weeks. It was nothing serious, not even a special reason behind it. It was just a random choice, an escape from the noise of my regular life. I wanted something simple. A weekend alone in the woods with no phone service, no notifications, no distractions. I picked a spot on the map that looked quiet. It wasn't a well-known campsite, more of a patch of forest tucked near a river, about 3 hours away from where I lived. I thought it was perfect because hardly anyone wrote about camping there online, which made me feel like I'd have it all to myself. The drive out was calm, just miles of road cutting through fields and patches of trees. The farther I went, the less traffic I saw. By the time I turned onto the last narrow gravel road, I hadn't passed another car for at least half an hour. I felt good about that. It meant the place would be empty, peaceful. The sun was still high, the sky clear, and I rolled the windows down to let the air in. It smelled like grass, warm dirt, and the faint sweetness of pine. I parked near the tree line where the road ended, hauled my backpack and gear out of the car, and set off down a faint path that seemed like it hadn't been used in a long time. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and dry leaves, but it was easy enough to follow. My plan was simple. Hike in a bit, find a flat clearing near the river, set up camp, cook something, and enjoy the quiet. After about 20 minutes of walking, I found it. The trees opened into a small clearing, the river only 30 or so feet away. The water was moving slow, wide and shallow, with smooth rocks sticking out here and there. The bank smelled of damp earth and moss, and the air felt cooler that close to the water. It was exactly what I had pictured in my head, maybe even better. I set my backpack down, stretched, and got to work. I pitched the tent first. The ground was soft, so it took a bit of effort to get the stakes firm, but it held well enough. Then I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and set my gear in neat piles. I always liked things orderly when I camped. The sun filtered through the trees, throwing patches of light across the tent fabric. Everything seemed calm, safe, even boring in the best way. I collected some wood for a small fire, using the knife I carried to strip bark and break smaller sticks. I didn't need a huge fire, just enough to cook with and keep me warm after dark. Once the pile was set, I boiled water from the river, filtered through the pump I carried, and made a simple meal. The smell of noodles and smoke mixed in the air. The hours passed easily. I walked along the riverbank, skipped rocks into the current, and sat listening to the forest. It was quiet but not silent. Birds called from high branches, insects buzzed near the water, and somewhere far off I thought I heard a woodpecker hammering at a tree. Everything seemed alive, moving, but in a natural rhythm that felt far removed from the rush of the city. When evening came, I built the fire back up and watched the light fade through the trees. The orange glow of the flames flickered against the trunks, throwing shadows that moved in slow, uneven ways. I sat on a log, ate a granola bar, and just watched the fire until the stars came out. That first night should have been perfect, but something felt a little off. It wasn't anything big at first, just a sound. It was late, maybe close to midnight. I had crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and was lying in my sleeping bag. The fire outside had burned down to a pile of glowing coals. I listened to the faint hiss of the river and tried to let myself drift off. Then I heard it, leaves crunching. It wasn't close, not right against the tent, but it wasn't far either. It came from the trees on the other side of the clearing. Slow steps, heavy enough to be more than a squirrel or raccoon. At first, I thought it might be a deer. That was normal, nothing dangerous. I told myself not to worry, to just stay calm. But then the steps paused. It was quiet for a long time. Then another crunch, slower this time, like someone trying to be careful. I lay there, frozen, my ears straining. My breathing felt loud inside the sleeping bag. I waited, every second stretching out longer than it should have. Eventually, the sound faded. Either whoever or whatever it was had moved off, or I just couldn't hear it anymore. I stayed awake for at least another hour, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening for the tiniest sound. Nothing else came. Finally, my eyes grew heavy, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning made everything feel less threatening. I unzipped the tent to see sunlight pouring across the clearing, the fire pit cold and gray. The ground looked normal. I walked the edge of the trees where I thought I'd heard the sound the night before. Nothing stood out. No obvious tracks, no broken branches, just forest floor. I convinced myself it really had just been a deer. They were common enough, and I had no reason to think it was anything else. The second day went smoothly. I hiked upriver, found a small waterfall tumbling over rocks, and spent a couple of hours sitting there with my feet in the water. The air smelled fresh and clean, and the spray from the falls cooled my skin. It felt like I had the entire world to myself. But that night, it happened again. I had gone to bed earlier, the fire still burning low. The forest around me was alive with the normal sounds. Crickets, the rush of water, the occasional flap of wings in the dark. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the shadows moving across the tent wall. Then the crunching started again. This time it was closer. Slow, steady, deliberate steps, like someone circling just outside the reach of the firelight. My chest tightened, and I gripped the knife I kept next to me. I didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply, just listened. The steps shifted around the clearing, never rushing, never stomping, just slow and careful. Leaves rustled, a twig snapped. It went on for minutes, maybe longer. I couldn't tell time in that state, frozen in place. At one point, I thought I saw the faintest shadow pass across the tent wall, just at the edge of the fire's glow. It was gone in an instant. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound faded again. The forest went back to its regular noises, like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay awake, clutching the knife, waiting for the first light of morning. When it came, I stepped out of the tent with my heart still pounding. I searched the clearing carefully this time, walking slow, scanning the ground. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but near the edge of the trees, in a patch of soft dirt, I saw it. A footprint. It wasn't deep, but it was clear enough. Too big to be mine, and definitely not a deer or bear. A shoe print. Someone had been there, watching. That was the moment the trip shifted. It stopped being random relaxation and turned into something else entirely. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything and heading back to the car. But part of me resisted. I told myself maybe it had been a hiker passing through. Maybe they were just curious about the smoke from my fire. Maybe it wasn't as sinister as it felt. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The third day dragged. Every noise made me turn my head. Every rustle in the brush made me tighten my grip on the knife at my side. I tried to fish in the river, but I couldn't focus. I tried to read the book I'd brought, but I couldn't keep my eyes on the page. All I did was wait for night, dreading it. That night was the worst. I had barely put the fire down to coals when the sounds started again. Not from one direction this time, but from two. Footsteps, careful and slow, on opposite sides of the clearing. Two people. My whole body tensed, cold sweat breaking across my back. I sat in the tent, knife in hand, heart hammering. They were moving, circling, always just outside the light. Leaves crunched, twigs cracked, low rustles in the brush. Then silence. I waited, not moving. My ears strained, but nothing came. The silence pressed down heavier than the footsteps had. And then, suddenly, a hand brushed against the fabric of the tent. I jerked back, choking on my own breath, heart exploding in my chest. The fabric shifted slightly under the touch, then let go. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just stared at the thin wall of fabric separating me from whoever was out there. Minutes passed, or hours, I don't know. The footsteps didn't return. The hand didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have blacked out. When morning came, I made my choice. I packed everything, quickly. My hands shook as I shoved gear into the bag, rolled the tent without care, and kicked dirt over the fire pit. I wanted out, but as I slung the pack onto my shoulders and turned toward the path back to the car, I froze. In the soft dirt at the edge of the clearing, right where the path began, were more prints. Clear shoe prints, facing the tent. Standing there, watching. I didn't stop again. I didn't eat, didn't drink, just marched down that trail as fast as I could. I had gone camping more times than I could count, but I never thought a simple trip would change the way I look at the woods forever. I wanted to spend a few days away from the noise of the city, away from the constant buzzing of phones and people. I picked a random spot on the map, an area not too far from home, but still deep enough in the wilderness that I knew I wouldn't see anyone else for miles. The place was thick with trees, with a small river cutting through it. I had no real plan, just a tent, some gear, and the hope of some quiet days. The drive took me a few hours. The last stretch was rough dirt road where branches scraped the sides of my car, and at times I wondered if it was worth it. When I finally parked, I saw nothing but dense forest stretching endlessly in every direction. I grabbed my pack, locked the car, and set off on foot. The air was clean, cooler than in town, and filled with the smell of pine and damp earth. My boots crunched on the fallen leaves as I walked deeper and deeper into the woods. After about an hour of hiking, I found a small clearing near the riverbank. It wasn't perfectly flat, but it was good enough for a tent. The water was clear and moving steadily, just wide enough that I couldn't jump across, but shallow enough that I could wade if I wanted. I decided that was the spot. I dropped my pack, unrolled the tent, and began setting it up. The process was almost automatic, something I'd done so many times before. The poles clicked into place, the fabric stretched tight, and soon I had my little shelter standing there with the door flap facing the river. I built a fire pit next, collecting stones and arranging them into a circle. Then I went to gather wood. The forest floor was littered with branches, some still damp, some dry enough to snap easily. I carried armfuls back and stacked them neatly. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun was dipping behind the trees. The light turned orange, then red, and then the shadows began to stretch long across the ground. I cooked a simple meal on the fire, just a pack of noodles and some jerky, and sat there watching the smoke rise into the canopy. The woods were quiet, but not silent. I could hear the river trickling, insects buzzing, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I told myself it was rabbits or squirrels, nothing more. Still, I felt a little tension building in me, like the weight of the forest pressing in. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The sounds seemed louder when I wasn't looking at anything, just staring into the dark. The rustling was closer at times, then farther away. A couple of times, I thought I heard footsteps, but I kept reminding myself it was probably deer moving around. I pulled the bag tighter around me and forced my eyes shut until sleep finally came. The next morning, I woke with the sun cutting through the fabric of the tent. My back was stiff from the hard ground, but the fresh air made me feel alive. I boiled some water from the river, dropped in a tea bag, and sat by the fire pit. Everything seemed calm again. I spent the day exploring. I followed the river upstream, climbing over rocks and stepping through mud. The forest felt endless, and after a while, I realized I hadn't marked my path. I forced myself to turn back, following the water until I reached camp again. By then, the sun was high, and the fire had gone cold. I decided to rest, laying on the grass near the tent. The sky was a clear blue with no clouds. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the shadows had grown long again. Evening had come fast. I got up, stretched, and went to collect more firewood. That's when I noticed something strange. About 50 feet from camp, the ground looked disturbed, like someone had been digging. I walked over, my boots sinking into the soft dirt. There was a shallow hole, not deep, maybe 2 feet wide, with loose soil piled around it. It didn't look like an animal digging for food. It looked like someone had taken a shovel and just stopped halfway. I crouched down, staring at it. The dirt was fresh, still damp. I looked around the trees, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just the thick forest. A chill went through me. I told myself maybe it was some old site, but the freshness of the soil told a different story. I walked back to camp, trying to shake it off. I built the fire up high that night, the flames leaping, casting long shadows across the clearing. I ate quickly and sat close to the light. The woods around me seemed darker than before, like the night had teeth. When I finally got into the tent, I left the fire burning. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening again. This time, the sounds were sharper. The rustling wasn't random. It had a pattern: pause, step, pause, step. My chest tightened as I realized it really sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then silence. Nothing but the crackle of the fire outside. I stayed awake for hours, waiting, staring at the thin fabric of the tent that was the only thing between me and the woods. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I stepped out and immediately noticed something wrong. The fire had burned low to embers, but the woodpile I stacked was scattered. Not like it had fallen over, but like someone had kicked through it. My stomach sank. I checked around camp, looking for tracks. The dirt and leaves made it hard to tell, but I thought I saw faint impressions, larger than any animal I knew. I thought about leaving right then, packing everything, walking back to the car, and getting out. But I told myself I was overthinking. Maybe a deer had stumbled through, maybe the wind had knocked the woodpile down. I didn't want to believe anything else. I spent the day fishing in the river, trying to keep busy. I caught nothing, just wasted hours watching the water. But every time I turned toward the woods, I felt eyes on me. Couldn't shake it. By the time I got back to camp, it was already growing dim again. I forced myself to eat, but my stomach was tight, and every sound from the forest made me flinch. I built the fire bigger than ever, feeding it with every branch I had. The flames roared, the sparks flying up into the night. That night in the tent, I didn't sleep. The footsteps came back, closer this time, around the tent. Slow, careful. I held my breath so hard my lungs burned. I could hear twigs snapping under weight. My hands trembled inside the sleeping bag. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence again. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually the first light of dawn seeped through. When I stepped outside, my heart almost stopped. There were marks in the dirt. Clear marks. Footprints. Human. They circled the tent. I froze, staring at them. My skin went cold. Someone had been there, moving around me while I tried not to breathe. I packed fast. My hands shook as I shoved everything into my pack. The tent, the gear, all of it. I didn't care about neatness anymore. I just wanted out. I slung the pack on my shoulders, doused the fire, and started walking toward where I thought the car was. But the forest looked different. I had gone deeper than I thought, and the trees seemed to twist around me. I followed the river, telling myself it would lead me back, but hours passed and I saw nothing familiar. My legs grew tired, my throat dry. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. Leaves crunching, branches snapping. Always a few steps back, never close enough to see. I kept moving, panic rising. The forest was thick, the light fading. I realized I might not make it out before dark. I stumbled, nearly falling, and when I caught myself, I saw something ahead through the trees. A shape. At first, I thought it was another person. Relief shot through me, but as I stepped closer, I saw it was something else. Another campsite. Old, abandoned. A tent collapsed and torn. Fabric shredded like claws had ripped it. A rusted fire pit, blackened with ash. Empty food wrappers scattered around, faded from weather. I stood frozen, staring. Whoever had camped here had left in a hurry, or worse. The hole I'd seen before came to mind, and a wave of sickness washed over me. The sound came again, footsteps. Behind me, I spun, but there was nothing, just the endless trees. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I didn't stay. I ran. I didn't care about noise or direction, just away. My pack slammed against my back. Branches cut my arms. My breath tore through my throat. I ran until my legs nearly gave out. When I finally stumbled into a familiar stretch of river, I could have cried. I followed it down, forcing myself forward until the trees began to thin. And then, through the gaps, I saw it, my car. I burst out of the woods, rushed to the driver's side, and threw my pack in. My hands fumbled the keys, my whole body shaking, but finally the engine roared to life. I slammed it into gear and sped down the dirt road, branches scraping again, but I didn't care. I didn't stop until I hit pavement miles away. Only then did I pull over, gripping the steering wheel. I had gone camping before, but never by myself, and that was the part that felt different when I packed my small old tent into the back of my car and started driving out to the forest that sat a little over 3 hours away from where I lived. It wasn't a famous spot, not the kind of place where tourists went with cameras or big hiking groups. It was just a stretch of woods I had once passed through on a long drive, a place where I had noticed an empty gravel turnout and a barely marked trail leading into the trees. Something about the quietness of that stretch of road stuck with me, and now, weeks later, I had convinced myself it would make the perfect solo trip. The highway turned to winding back roads, and then even those started to narrow, until the trees grew taller and denser on both sides, and I barely passed another car for nearly an hour. I kept the windows rolled down, letting the late summer air drift through. It smelled sharp and earthy, the kind of smell that always reminded me of dry pine needles and the dusty ground of a trail that had been warmed all day by the sun. I felt good then, the kind of confidence that comes before you actually face the silence you thought you wanted. When I finally reached the small gravel turnout, I cut the engine and just sat there for a minute. The sound of the car cooling down ticked softly under the hood. Beyond the guardrail, the trees stretched in all directions, thick trunks with deep shade pooled between them. The sun was still high, but the woods swallowed most of the light, making it hard to see very far. I grabbed my pack and tent and slipped through the thin trailhead that looked more like a deer path than a real hiking trail. The trail dipped quickly, leading me down into thicker brush. Every step crunched against dry leaves. Spiderwebs stretched across narrow sections, and every time I walked through one, I felt that sticky thread across my face and arms. The path was uneven and sometimes seemed to vanish, only to reappear a few feet later. It felt less like a place made for people and more like I was intruding. That unsettled feeling was small at first, but I noticed it. After about 40 minutes, the ground leveled out into a small clearing. The grass was patchy, the earth bare in places, but it was flat enough to set up camp. The trees pressed in on all sides, their branches heavy, bending slightly over the clearing. I picked the spot near the center, unrolled the tent, and started hammering the stakes into the soil. Setting up the camp kept my hands busy, but I was already aware of how quiet everything felt. There were birds, yes, and the occasional flick of leaves when something small darted through the undergrowth, but there was also a heavy kind of stillness. It was the kind of silence that felt like it was waiting. Once the tent was up, I walked around the clearing, just pacing in slow circles, trying to shake off the strange unease. I dropped my pack inside, then gathered a pile of dry sticks and wood for a fire. The sun was starting to slide down behind the trees, and shadows lengthened fast. I built the fire carefully, stacking the sticks into a small teepee, and when the flame finally caught, I sat back on the dirt and just stared at it. For a while, everything felt almost normal. I boiled some water, ate a packet of noodles, and stretched my legs out. The fire popped and spat, and the smell of burning pine drifted up into the night. The darkness around me was complete now. The woods beyond the fire line turned into a wall of black, and I couldn't see more than a few feet past the glow. I thought about how if someone stood just out there, just beyond that edge, I wouldn't know. That thought slid into my mind and stayed there. Every small noise became sharper once the fire was the only light. Branches creaked, an owl called, and something shuffled in the leaves once or twice. Each time, my head snapped up, my eyes searching the dark, but I saw nothing. I kept feeding the fire until the flames burned steady and strong, then finally crawled into the tent. Inside, the air was still warm, but I pulled my sleeping bag around me anyway. The nylon walls of the tent felt thin, almost fragile, and every noise outside seemed louder when I was lying there. I could hear the crackle of the fire just a few feet away, but underneath it, there were softer sounds, dry leaves being brushed aside, twigs snapping lightly, as though something was moving very slowly around the clearing. I held still, listening, trying to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. But the steps didn't sound like the fast darting of an animal. They sounded careful. They sounded like weight shifting on soil, then pausing, then shifting again. I lay there for what felt like an hour, staring into the dark roof of the tent. Every muscle in my body tensed. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, though it was the kind of sleep that kept breaking. I woke several times in the night, hearing small snaps and rustles, and each time my heart raced. When dawn came, pale light slid through the thin fabric of the tent. I unzipped it quickly, almost expecting to see something sitting right outside, but the clearing looked the same as the night before. My fire had burned to cold gray ash. I shook off the night and tried to feel normal again. I boiled water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to hike a little deeper into the woods. I left my camp set up, packed a smaller bag with water and snacks, and followed what looked like a faint trail leading downhill. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods grew. Vines hung low, and the ground was uneven with roots. I kept going for nearly an hour until I came across a small stream. The water trickled over smooth rocks, and the air was cooler near it. I sat for a while, letting my feet rest, listening to the water. That was when I noticed it. Across the stream, just barely visible through the trees, was something pale. At first, I thought it was just a fallen log catching the light, but the longer I stared, the more I realized it wasn't shaped like a log. It was more vertical, thinner, like the side of a tree stripped bare. Curious, I crossed the stream, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet rocks, and pushed through the brush. As I got closer, I saw it clearly. It was a tree, yes, but not naturally stripped. Its bark had been cut away in a wide, clean section, exposing the raw wood underneath. And carved deep into that wood were long vertical slashes, almost like claw marks, except they weren't random. They were evenly spaced, deliberate. My stomach tightened as I ran my fingers lightly over the grooves. They were too clean, too sharp. Not an animal. A knife. Someone had cut into this tree carefully, intentionally. I stood there for a long time, looking at it, trying to think of a reason. A marker, maybe, or some bored hunter. But there was something unsettling about the precision. It didn't look like a game. It looked like someone marking territory. I turned back toward my camp after that, moving faster than before, the woods suddenly feeling different. It was like the silence had weighed again, pressing against me. Every time I thought I heard something behind me, I spun around, but the trail was empty. Back at the clearing, everything was as I left it, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone step out. The carved tree stuck in my mind all afternoon. I decided to keep the fire going long before dark this time, stacking more wood beside it. When night came again, the fear came back with it. The fire burned, but the dark around it was endless. I ate, tried to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Not just rustling this time, a definite step, then another, slow, deliberate, circled. My firelight didn't reach far, but I caught movement once, a shadow slipping between trunks. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. I sat frozen by the fire, gripping the small pocket knife I had, though I knew it was useless if someone really wanted to do something. The steps faded, then came back from another side, like whoever or whatever was out there was testing how close they could get without being seen. Hours passed like that. I never slept. I just stared into the dark until, finally, the faint gray light of morning began to touch the tops of the trees. By the third day, I knew I couldn't stay. The carved tree, the steps, the constant feeling of being watched. It all added up to something I couldn't explain away. I packed my gear quickly, shoving everything into my bag without care, stamping out the fire until smoke hissed against the dirt. The hike back to my car felt longer this time. Every step I half expected to hear another set behind me. The woods felt tighter, as if they wanted me gone. When I finally saw the thin strip of gravel through the trees, relief surged through me so hard I almost jogged the last stretch. My car sat there alone, just as I left it. But when I opened the door, my stomach dropped. On the driver's side window, smeared across the glass in long, even strokes, was the same pattern I had seen carved into the tree. 5 deep, vertical marks dragged from top to bottom. I didn't look back. I just drove, gravel spitting out behind me, the woods shrinking in the rearview mirror. Even now, weeks later, I keep thinking about those marks. They weren't random. They were the same, cut into a tree deep in the forest, then left for me. I had planned the hike for months, spending evenings poring over maps and reading trail reports. The forest I chose was dense, with ridges and hidden valleys, a place people talked about in hushed tones as untamed. That word was the main lure for me, the sense of stepping somewhere unmarked, untouched, and dangerous enough to feel real. I had hiked alone before, but never this far into a wilderness that had very little cell reception and no maintained trails. I packed carefully, enough water, food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, an extra battery, and a heavy-duty knife strapped to my belt. I left my car at the trailhead at dawn, the early sunlight slicing through the mist that hung low over the parking lot. The initial climb was straightforward. The path was steep, but well-worn in patches, dotted with fallen leaves and twisted roots. Early on, the forest was alive with bird calls and the soft rustling of small animals. I felt comfortable. I told myself that the isolation was part of the draw. There was a strange beauty in the way the sunlight hit the moss on the rocks, the way the air smelled damp and earthy. But as I ascended, the trail began to fade. Signs of human traffic disappeared. Only broken twigs and faint, Indistinct marks in the dirt suggested anyone else had passed this way recently. Around midday, I reached a ridge that overlooked a small, hidden valley. The view was stunning. Green canopy stretching endlessly, a river cutting through the foliage far below. But there was also a sharp drop near the edge. I moved cautiously, testing each step before committing my weight. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. Sunlight became patchy, filtered through thick branches and large, dark leaves. My pack felt heavier. The temperature dropped subtly, and the wind had an almost whispering quality as it threaded through the treetops. I made my first real mistake here, moving off what little trail remained. A combination of arrogance and curiosity drove me. The map suggested a hidden waterfall was nearby, tucked away in a side ravine, and the idea of finding it alone thrilled me. The ground underfoot was uneven, loose, and slick with fallen pine needles. One wrong step could send me tumbling down the slope. I didn't realize at the time how quickly the terrain could shift from challenging to perilous. Branches snagged at my backpack, and I had to crouch under fallen trees that blocked the narrow path. My legs ached from twisting and balancing on rocks, and a bead of sweat ran down my spine despite the cool air. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the ravine. The waterfall itself was smaller than I imagined, but the way it spilled over a jagged cliff and into a shallow pool gave it an almost eerie beauty. I sat on a nearby rock, my legs trembling from exertion, and took a long drink from my water bottle. The silence was different here. The usual background sounds of the forest had diminished. Even the river far below seemed muted. There was a weight to the air, heavy with dampness and a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. I felt a small thrill of unease, but I shook it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself, the mind playing tricks when nothing else was around. When I decided to leave, the trouble began. The route I had come down was no longer obvious. Rocks had shifted, fallen trees blocked my path, and the ridge I had seen from above was now obscured by thick brush. I tried to backtrack, but every turn seemed to bring me deeper into dense undergrowth. The forest floor was littered with roots that threatened to trip me with every step, and rocks that were slick from moss and moisture made climbing treacherous. My water was half gone, and my food untouched, but I didn't feel hungry yet. I was focused entirely on finding a recognizable landmark, anything that would orient Maine. Hours passed, and my earlier confidence began to fade into a gnawing anxiety. The sun began to drop behind the canopy. Shadows grew long and stretched across the uneven ground, turning even familiar shapes into threatening figures. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my heart leap. I tried to mark my path with broken branches and piles of stones, but the dense undergrowth made it hard to see even the markers from a few feet away. The feeling of being watched crept in, not because I saw anyone, but because the forest was alive with subtle movements. Branches swaying, leaves shaking, small animals scattering. I had left the main trail hours ago, but now I realized I had no idea where it ran. My map was useless here. GPS on my phone showed a signal, weak and flickering, but it was unreliable, bouncing between locations as though the forest itself interfered. Night fell faster than I expected. Darkness didn't just cover the forest, it swallowed it. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, and the beam from my flashlight made eerie shadows that twisted across trees and rocks. My legs were cramping, my pack felt like it weighed double, and every sound seemed amplified. Somewhere nearby, something large moved. I didn't see it, but the sound of heavy footsteps, or maybe just a rock rolling, sent my pulse racing. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. Nothing repeated, but the forest didn't feel the same. I had been alone in forests before, but there had always been a path to follow, a trail to cling to. This was different. I had no reference points, no way of knowing whether I was climbing, descending, or moving in circles. I forced myself to keep moving, taking one cautious step after another. I found a shallow creek and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a larger waterway and eventually back to the main trail. The creek was rocky and the water cold, running over slippery stones that made my footing precarious. I fell twice, scraping my hands and bruising my knees, Each fall made me more aware of how vulnerable I was. My flashlight was running low, and the thought of being trapped in total darkness gnawed at me. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since morning, and the energy drain was starting to affect my decision-making. Hours passed like this. The forest was unrelenting, an endless maze of trunks, boulders, and fallen trees. My mind began to play cruel tricks, turning ordinary shapes into potential threats, the sound of water into footsteps following me. I felt like I was being watched, but rationally, I knew I was alone. Still, the fear was visceral, gripping my chest, making my hands shake, and sending my heart hammering. I started whispering encouragements to myself, silently, like it would make a difference. My throat was dry, my stomach empty, and my legs screamed with fatigue. Every part of me wanted to sit down and give up, but I couldn't. Giving up here could mean something worse. Tripping in the dark, falling into the creek, or twisting an ankle on rocks where no one would find me for days. Somewhere near midnight, I came across a slope that seemed familiar, a ridge I must have passed during the day. Exhaustion gave me the focus to climb carefully. My hands tore against the rough bark and jagged rocks, my body straining with every step. When I reached the top, the first thing I noticed was a faint, artificial light in the distance. My heart leapt. A road? A campsite? People? I forced myself to move quickly toward it. The slope descended sharply, loose rocks underfoot, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had. I stumbled, fell, and scraped my shoulder, but I kept going. Finally, I emerged onto a dirt road, the kind used by rangers and forest maintenance crews. The light came from a vehicle parked nearby. I waved, my legs trembling, my entire body soaked in sweat and dirt. Someone noticed me, and they came over. The relief was overwhelming. I realized I had been lost for more than 12 hours. The man in the truck offered me water and blankets, and I sat on the ground, trembling, exhausted, and almost in tears. I gave him the rough coordinates from my GPS. He told me I was lucky. The terrain I had been hiking was nearly impossible to navigate in the dark, with cliffs and dense undergrowth that could trap someone for days. I spent the night at the ranger station, eating food, wrapping myself in blankets, and trying to calm down. I thought about how close I had come to serious injury, maybe worse. I thought about how easy it would have been to misstep, fall into a ravine, and not be found for days. I thought about the isolation, the forest that seemed benign in daylight but became an unrelenting maze at night. And I realized that the allure of untamed wilderness wasn't worth underestimating its danger. The next day, when I drove back home, every muscle in my body sore and bruised, I couldn't stop thinking about the forest. It hadn't been magical or beautiful in a way that mattered. It had been merciless, and I had barely survived by a combination of luck, persistence, and stubbornness. I made a promise to myself never to take the wild for granted again. Maps, planning, and caution weren't enough. Respect for the sheer unpredictability of nature was what mattered most. And I realized painfully that the forest doesn't care about skill or confidence. It only cares that you I had always loved hiking, the feeling of being alone in the wilderness, the weight of my pack, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, the way the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was a certain satisfaction in relying on yourself, in knowing that no one could help you if you made a mistake, and that every step had to be deliberate, careful, and measured. I had done long hikes before, some for days at a time, and I considered myself fairly experienced. I liked challenging trails, isolated paths, and places where the trail disappeared into the raw, untamed land. It was during one of those hikes that I found myself in a situation I had never imagined, where fear didn't come from the dark or the unknown, but from something far more real and immediate. The hike began early in the morning. I had planned it meticulously, checked the weather, studied the topography, and packed all the essentials. I left my car at a small trailhead, far from the main roads, where the gravel was scattered and the trees pressed close to the edges of the parking area. The sky was still pale with the first hints of sunlight when I stepped onto the trail. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles, a smell I had come to associate with peace. I started at a brisk pace, the rhythm of my boots striking the ground, the straps of my pack snug against my shoulders, the small knife on my belt a comforting presence. The trail was steep at first, winding through thick undergrowth and clusters of young trees. I passed a small creek that gurgled and twisted among rocks and roots, the water cold and clear. I paused to drink and refill my bottle, crouching on the smooth stones and watching the light shift on the ripples. The solitude was complete. No other hikers, no distant cars, no birds in sight. Only the wind and the crunching of leaves under my feet. I liked this part of hiking, the absolute isolation. It made me feel alive. As I ascended, the trail became less distinct. There were markings, but they were faint, small paint blazes on trees that had started to fade, some partially hidden under moss or lichen. I kept an eye out, knowing I would need them. The terrain was rugged, with steep slopes and loose rocks underfoot. The forest thickened, the trees older and more twisted, roots snaking across the path like natural obstacles designed to trip you. I used my trekking poles to steady myself, and I took my time, careful with each step. At one point, the trail disappeared completely, leaving only a faint impression in the soil. I stopped, looked around, and tried to retrace my steps, but the terrain had shifted subtly with fallen branches and debris. I decided to follow what seemed like the trail, even though it was becoming a gamble. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, but the canopy of dense trees left the forest floor in shadow. I drank water, ate some trail mix, and checked my watch. I still had plenty of daylight to reach my planned camping spot, a small clearing near the top of a ridge that overlooked a valley. The clearing was supposed to have a spring nearby, but I had to be cautious. I knew the map, but maps in areas like this were often imprecise, and the terrain changed faster than any printed lines could show. At some point, I noticed a strange sensation, the kind that creeps up gradually. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost unnaturally so. Birds were absent, and even the wind felt dampened, as if the thick trees were swallowing sound. I paused and listened, trying to shake off the unease. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, that the trail being rough and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I continued, but the path became almost non-existent. The forest floor was uneven, covered in decaying leaves, fallen branches, and moss. My boots sank slightly into wet soil in places, and my poles slipped on slick roots. I had to navigate around trees, scramble over fallen logs, and find footholds on the rocky slope. My energy started to ebb, and I began to feel the strain in my legs and shoulders. I drank more water and tried to keep my mind on the rhythm of moving forward rather than the creeping sense of being watched. By mid-afternoon, the sun was lower, and the shadows grew long. I finally reached a point that looked like it could be the ridge, a slightly flattened area among tall pines. But the clearing I expected wasn't there. There was no open space, no spring, nothing but thick undergrowth and uneven ground. I realized I must have missed a turn, or perhaps the trail I was following was no longer maintained and had faded entirely. I checked my compass and tried to orient myself. The ridge ran roughly east-west, and I needed to move north to follow the plan. But the terrain was steep, and the ground below fell sharply into a shadowed valley. I made the decision to climb higher, hoping that reaching the top would give me a better view. I pushed through thick underbrush, pulling myself over roots and rocks, feeling my heart race as the slope steepened. My pack felt heavier with every step, sweat running down my face despite the cool air. I finally reached a small plateau, not the one I intended, but a spot where I could catch my breath. The forest stretched endlessly around me, and I could just make out the valley below, dark and shadowed. It was then that I noticed something strange. On the slope across from me, there were disturbances in the undergrowth, subtle at first but unmistakable. Branches bent and snapped, leaves shifted, and there was a low, irregular movement that didn't seem natural. My stomach tightened. I froze, scanning the area, trying to determine what it was. There were no birds, no other animals, just that movement, irregular and deliberate. I thought maybe it was a deer or some forest creature, but it didn't move like any animal I had seen. I waited, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the slope. Then I saw it clearly. A figure, or something that looked human, was moving slowly, deliberately across the trees. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but the movements were wrong, too stiff, too cautious, almost stalking in nature. I ducked behind a tree, heart hammering, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But the figure kept moving, maintaining a distance, never crossing the slope fully into the clearing, but always visible in glimpses. Panic set in. My first thought was to leave, to descend and try to get back to the trail, but the slope below was treacherous and I had no clear path. I considered climbing higher to reach a more open area, but the ridge continued, and I wasn't sure if it would lead to safety or just deeper into the forest. I needed to think. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack, gripping my trekking poles, ready to move quickly. The figure paused, as if sensing me. I froze. It was hard to see clearly, but it was wearing dark clothing and seemed to have some kind of pack. The stance was deliberate, and it started moving toward me slowly, carefully. I realized then that it was following the same path I had taken, perhaps watching, perhaps tracking. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but running on that terrain could be fatal. I had to move strategically. I backed away slowly, keeping trees between us, trying to find a slope that led safely downward. My mind raced through options. I thought about screaming, making noise, but that would only reveal my location. I remembered the whistle in my pack and considered using it to attract help, but with no one around, it might only provoke the person following me. I had to descend quietly, carefully, and put distance between us. I began to navigate down the slope, sliding over loose soil and stepping carefully on exposed roots. Every snap of a branch underfoot made me flinch. The figure mirrored my movements at a distance, never closing too fast but always present. My heart was in my throat, and my breath came in short, sharp bursts. Hours seemed to stretch into minutes, each movement deliberate. My senses heightened to every sound, every shadow, every shift in the forest. Eventually, the slope leveled into a smaller valley, the terrain more forgiving. I picked up the pace, though still careful, and kept the figure out of direct sight. I was exhausted, legs burning, but adrenaline kept me moving. I looked for a path, a creek, anything that could lead me back to a main trail. Then I saw it, a faint trail, partially overgrown but recognizable. I moved toward it, heart racing, glancing back. The figure had stopped on the higher slope, watching me, then slowly retreated, disappearing into the forest. I didn't wait to see more. Once on the trail, I moved faster, using the last of my energy to descend toward a known junction. The forest was alive again with normal sounds. Birds, the wind, the rustling of leaves. Relief washed over me, but I remained alert, scanning the trees. I reached a small creek, the sound of water soothing, and followed it downhill, hoping it would lead me to a larger trail or road. Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I finally emerged onto a wider, maintained trail. My legs were trembling, my pack heavy, and I was covered in sweat, dirt, and scratches from the underbrush. I could see the faint glow of headlights on a distant road and moved toward it, breaking into a run despite exhaustion. When I reached my car, I had been planning this hike for months, carefully studying maps, checking trails, and watching the weather reports. The forest I chose wasn't famous, not a tourist hotspot, just a sprawling stretch of national park that few people ventured into. The solitude was part of the appeal. I wanted to escape the noise, the constant movement of the city, the faces and voices that never stopped. I needed silence, and I thought the forest could give it to me. I started early in the morning before the sun fully rose. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. I had packed lightly: a backpack with water, a small first aid kit, some energy bars, a flashlight, a spare battery, and a compact map. My hiking boots were worn in but sturdy, and I wore layers: a thin t-shirt, a fleece jacket, and a waterproof shell. I had my phone, of course, though I knew signal would fade once I got deeper. I didn't care. I wanted to be cut off. The trail began gently, a narrow dirt path winding between thick stands of pine. Sunlight filtered through the branches, dust motes floating in the shafts of light. Birds chirped in the trees, and I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. I moved steadily, my breathing slow and even, enjoying the rhythm of walking. After about an hour, the trail became steeper, climbing a ridge that overlooked a narrow valley. The ground underfoot shifted from compact dirt to loose stones, making each step require more attention. I paused at a clearing to drink some water. Looking down into the valley, I could see the fog rolling along the river below, curling around the tree trunks like smoke. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing but wind through the trees and the occasional creak of a branch. I felt an odd sense of both calm and unease. There was freedom in the isolation, but also a creeping awareness that I was completely alone. After another hour, the trail started to split. I paused, checking my map carefully. One path followed the ridge, narrow and steep, with sheer drops on one side. The other dropped into a small canyon, winding along the edge of the stream below. Both trails looked challenging. I chose the ridge, thinking the view would be worth it. The path was barely wide enough for 1 foot at a time in places, and loose stones slid under my boots. I had to move slowly, deliberately. Every step required my full attention. By mid-morning, the trail had become almost unnavigable. Trees leaned across the path, fallen branches littered the ground, and some sections had eroded completely, leaving small cliffs of dirt and stone. I had to scramble over rocks, reach up to grab branches, and occasionally lower myself carefully down steep slopes. My heart rate increased, not from exertion, but from the sense of exposure. One misstep could send me tumbling down the side of the ridge, and there was no one to help me. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning on my knees and looking around. The forest here was ancient, dense, and the canopy thick enough that sunlight barely reached the ground. Everything was shades of green and brown. Moss clung to rocks, and roots twisted across the path like natural traps. I tried to calm my rising panic, telling myself that I was experienced, that I had done difficult hikes before. But this felt different. There was an intensity here, a sharpness to the isolation that gnawed at me. I pressed on, moving slowly, aware of every loose stone and branch underfoot. The trail curved sharply, and I thought I heard something. A soft crack, like a branch breaking far below. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Nothing. Maybe a deer. Maybe nothing at all. I told myself to focus. I had a long hike ahead, and fear could be my undoing if I let it take over. Around noon, I reached a section of the ridge that was almost vertical on one side. The path narrowed to less than a foot in places, with a sheer drop to my left. I had to cling to the rock wall with one hand while feeling for secure footing with my boots. The wind picked up, cold and biting, making me shiver through my layers. I inched along, counting steps, measuring each one. Took every ounce of concentration. Halfway across, I heard the sound again. A soft, deliberate snap, as if someone or something had stepped on a branch above. My breath caught. I froze. The sound didn't repeat, but the hairs on my neck stood on end. I scanned the trees, but there was no one. No movement. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another hiker? The trail was almost deserted. I hadn't seen a single person all morning. Could it be an animal? Bears lived in these forests, but I hadn't seen any signs. Still, the possibility made my stomach tighten. I moved faster now, though cautiously, trying to reach a wider section of trail. My muscles ached from the tension. My fingers scraped from gripping rough bark and stone. Sweat ran down my back, though the air was cold. My heart thumped in my chest, a constant drumbeat that matched the fear building in my mind. Finally, the trail opened up into a plateau. The ground here was more stable, flat, and covered with pine needles. I sank onto a fallen log, my legs trembling. I drank water and ate an energy bar, trying to calm my pulse. I told myself that the ridge section was behind me, and that once I followed the plateau, the trail would descend gently into the valley below. But even as I rested, A sense of unease lingered. Something about the ridge, about the sound of breaking branches, made me feel watched, exposed, vulnerable. I decided to follow the plateau toward the valley. The trail descended gradually, winding through thick underbrush and dense trees. The light dimmed as the canopy thickened, and I had to step carefully over roots and rocks hidden in shadow. My energy was draining faster than I expected. Every step required effort, not just physically but mentally, to maintain balance and focus. Mid-afternoon, I heard the sound again, this time closer, a crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, my body stiff. I turned slowly, scanning the forest. Nothing moved. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. A lost hiker, a stalker, a wild animal. I clenched my fists and tried to calm my breathing. Every instinct told me to move fast, to get to safety, but the trail was narrow, and running could make me fall. I decided to continue cautiously, stepping lightly, making deliberate movements. The crunching sound followed me, intermittent, sometimes far, sometimes near. It wasn't constant, but it was close enough to make my skin crawl. I considered calling for help on my phone, but I remembered the spotty reception. Better to keep moving than rely on a signal that might not exist. As the afternoon wore on, the trail grew darker. The sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows stretching across the forest floor. I realized I might not make it back before nightfall. My backpack felt heavier with each step, my legs burning from constant exertion. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. My mind oscillated between determination to finish the hike and the fear that I wasn't alone. I reached a small creek just as the last light faded. The water ran clear and cold, and I knelt to drink and splash my face. The sound of water was calming, a small reprieve from the constant tension. But as I stood, I noticed something. Footprints in the soft mud near the bank. Not my own. They were large, and the spacing suggested a heavier person, someone who had passed recently. My stomach tightened. The crunching sound, the feeling of being followed, the prints, it all connected. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was here, somewhere close. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't outrun someone without knowing where they were. I couldn't hide easily in the open forest. I needed a plan. I remembered a ridge just across the creek that led to a service road shown on my map. It would be a difficult climb, but it could lead me to safety. I had no choice. I waded through the creek, boots heavy with water, and started the climb. The slope was steep, slick with mud and moss. My hands scraped on rocks. My feet slipped. I cursed under my breath, forcing one step at a time, my heart hammering with exertion and fear. Behind me, the rustling continued, closer now. I didn't dare look. My focus was on the climb, on staying upright, on reaching the top. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes, I reached the top. The slope leveled out, and in the distance, I could just make out the service road through a break in the trees. Relief surged through me, sharp and physical. I didn't stop to rest. I ran as fast as I could over the uneven ground, my legs screaming, the pack heavy on my back. The crunching noises behind me stopped, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. Finally, I reached the service road. The ground was flat and solid. I could see tire tracks, signs of human activity. I ran along it until I saw a small maintenance shed, and beyond that, I had been planning this hike for months, checking weather forecasts, studying maps, and making lists of everything I would need. I wanted to push myself further than I ever had before, to take a trail that was considered difficult even for experienced hikers. The path was deep in the mountains, far from roads and towns, and I knew that if anything went wrong, help would be hours or even a full day away. I didn't tell anyone exactly when I was leaving or the trail I planned to take, not out of secrecy, but out of habit. I had always hiked alone, and I liked it that way. The freedom felt raw and personal. I started early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in faint oranges and purples. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of damp earth and pine needles. I carried a full backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothing, food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and water. I also carried a small hand crank radio and a flashlight, although I doubted I would need them if everything went according to plan. The trail was steep from the beginning, cutting through thick underbrush and clusters of trees so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. Every step required concentration. The soil was loose in places, and jagged roots twisted underfoot like hidden traps. I moved slowly, deliberately, resting every few hundred meters to catch my breath and take in the views. The mountains stretched endlessly around me, ridges layered upon ridges fading into the morning mist. There was a strange beauty in how silent it was. No birds sang nearby, no insects buzzed. It was almost as if the forest was holding its breath, watching me as much as I watched it. By midday, I had reached a narrow ridge where the trail skirted a steep drop. The wind blew fiercely there, whipping against my jacket and tugging at my backpack. I paused, gripping the rocks along the edge to steady myself. Looking down, I could see the valley floor far below, rivers carving silver paths through the dense forest. I took a deep breath and forced my legs forward, each step deliberate. The trail twisted and narrowed as I climbed higher. Loose rocks made the footing precarious. I felt a growing sense of isolation that I couldn't shake. Even though I had been hiking alone for years, there was something different about this trail. It felt untouched, almost untouched by humans in a way that was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying. I reached a plateau in the late afternoon. It was small, just enough space for my tent, but it had a view over a small creek far below. I decided to camp there for the night. Setting up the tent took longer than expected because the ground was uneven, dotted with rocks and hardened roots. I finally managed, securing all the stakes as tightly as I could. The sun was dipping behind the peaks by the time I finished, and a cold wind had begun to sweep through the ridge. I built a small fire, careful to clear all the dry leaves around it, and ate a simple meal of canned beans and bread. The fire's glow was comforting against the encroaching dark, but it did little to erase the gnawing feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I kept my flashlight close and listened to the forest around me. Every crackle of a twig or distant rustle made me flinch. I tried to rationalize it. Animals, the wind, but there was something in the way the sounds carried, sharp and deliberate, that unsettled me. The night passed slowly. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight within reach, staring at the ceiling of my tent as the wind howled outside. Around midnight, a loud crash echoed through the trees. My heart jumped. It sounded heavy, like a large branch snapping under the weight of something. I froze, listening. Then there was another noise, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving across rocks and fallen branches. I clutched my flashlight and pressed myself as low as I could. I told myself it was a deer or some other large animal, but my instinct screamed that it wasn't. I didn't sleep much after that. Every noise, every movement in the trees made me tense. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to remember my training, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. By dawn, I was exhausted and jittery, but I knew I had to continue. The next day, I planned to follow the trail down into the valley where the creek ran. My legs were sore from the climb, and my backpack felt heavier than usual. I moved carefully, testing each step on the loose rocks and uneven soil. About 2 hours into the descent, I noticed something strange. The trail ahead was partially blocked by a fallen tree, but the ground beneath it looked disturbed, as if someone or something had been there recently. Footprints? I couldn't tell for sure. They were irregular, not human, but too large and deliberate to belong to a deer. A cold knot of fear formed in my stomach. I considered turning back, but I was already committed to the trail. I continued cautiously, eyes scanning every shadow, ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from behind me. I froze, heart hammering, and waited. The wind carried it again, this time closer, punctuated by the snap of a branch. I didn't run. I didn't want to provoke whatever it was. Instead, I slowly shifted to the side, trying to keep my movements smooth and quiet. I kept my flashlight out, shining it toward the area behind me in quick bursts. The The growl didn't repeat, but the sense of being followed persisted. Every few steps, I glanced back. Shadows moved just beyond the tree line. I told myself it was a mountain lion or maybe a bear, and both were dangerous, but I had read survival guides and I knew staying calm was crucial. Hours passed like this. Every rustle, every snap, every bird startled me more than the last. I drank water and ate small bites of food, trying to keep my energy up. As I neared the creek, the trail became even more treacherous. Rocks slick with moss lined the edges, and water from recent rains had carved small streams across the path. My focus narrowed to every step. One slip and I could easily fall, or worse, be injured somewhere the wind couldn't reach me. Around late afternoon, I reached the creek. It was shallow but fast-moving, tumbling over rocks and creating small waterfalls. I followed it upstream, hoping to find a safer place to camp. The forest here was dense, and the sound of running water masked many of the noises that had been following me. For a few hours, I felt a fleeting sense of relief. Then I saw the footprints again. They were fresh, leading along the creek toward where I had been heading. My stomach turned. They were definitely human. The prints were irregular, as if the person who made them had been moving quickly or unsteadily. Whoever it was, they had been here very recently, maybe even minutes ago. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to think. I didn't have a phone signal and there was no one else around. If I ran, I could slip, fall, or get lost. If I stayed, I could be spotted. I decided to follow the creek a little further, hoping to reach a safer area where I could observe and decide. The terrain worsened. Steep banks, tangled roots, and wet rocks. My muscles screamed in protest. My hands cut and scraped from gripping rocks and branches. Night approached again earlier than I realized. I needed shelter, so I found a small overhang along the creek. It wasn't ideal, but it provided some cover. I huddled under it, exhausted, and ate the last of my food. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified. I wrapped my jacket around myself tightly, flashlight at the ready, and waited for sunrise. When morning came, I could see more clearly. The footprints were gone, but the sense of being followed remained. I considered leaving immediately, but the creek's edge was slippery and steep. I needed a safer path. I remembered a side trail marked on my map that led up to a ridge I had passed the day before. It was a longer route, but it might lead me back to a point where I could safely descend. I moved slowly, testing every step, using a stick to check the stability of the ground. The climb was grueling. I slipped multiple times, bruising my legs and arms. I had to rest frequently, sitting on rocks or clinging to trees for support. My mind replayed every noise from the previous night. I imagined being trapped, injured, and completely isolated. But I forced myself to focus on the trail one step at a time. By midday, I had reached the ridge. Relief washed over me as I saw a distant dirt road winding through the trees below. It was faint, but unmistakable. I had made it to a point where I could potentially get help. I carefully descended the ridge, moving cautiously but with renewed determination. The road grew closer, and I started shouting intermittently, hoping someone might hear me. Eventually, I reached the edge of the forest and stumbled onto the dirt road. Within an hour, a truck came by, driven by a local hiker who had seen my signal. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in scratches and bruises, but I was safe. The drive back to the nearest town felt surreal. The world outside the forest seemed almost unreal. I had always considered myself an experienced hiker. I had spent years navigating trails, camping in the wilderness, and pushing my body to the limit on long treks. So when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the remote mountains far from any towns or main roads, I thought I was prepared for anything. The trail I chose was known for its rugged terrain and sparse visitors. Most hikers only attempted it during the peak season, but I was determined to go in early spring, before the snow had fully melted, when the air was crisp and the forest was quiet. I started my hike early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The sky was a soft gray with streaks of orange, and the forest smelled damp and earthy. The trailhead was almost unmarked, just a small sign barely visible from the road, and I had parked my car in a tiny clearing nearby. The path started off gently, winding through towering pines and thick underbrush. I had studied the map thoroughly, memorized the landmarks, and double-checked my gear the night before. Backpack, water, high-calorie snacks, first aid kit, a sturdy knife, compass, flashlight, and extra batteries. I even carried a small rope in case I needed it. I had prepared for emergencies, or so I thought. The first few hours were uneventful. I walked at a steady pace, the crunch of pine needles and twigs under my boots the only sound. Birds called occasionally, but mostly it was the quiet of the forest. The trail was narrow and twisted, sometimes barely visible beneath patches of melting snow. Every so often, I had to cross small streams, careful not to slip on wet rocks. The air was cold, and I made sure to keep moving to stay warm. I had brought a jacket, gloves, and a hat, all of which I used. Around midday, I reached a small clearing with a view of the mountains in the distance. I stopped to rest, eat a snack, and take a sip of water. That's when I noticed something unusual. Footprints in the mud, partially covered by snow. They were human, large, and fresh, maybe only a few hours old. My first thought was relief. I wasn't entirely alone, and if I got into trouble, maybe someone else was nearby. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they didn't look like regular hiking boots. The prints were oddly deep, as if someone very heavy had walked through the soft ground, and the stride was uneven. It made my stomach tighten. I looked around the clearing, scanning the edges of the forest. Nothing moved. No birds, no animals. Not a single sound except the wind whispering through the trees. I tried to shake off the unease and continued on the trail. The terrain grew steeper as I ascended. Snow patches became larger, and some areas had ice that made footing treacherous. I used my trekking poles and rope in a few spots to steady myself and prevent slipping. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I noticed something else. Broken branches along the trail, as if someone had pushed through the trees roughly. At first, I thought it could be animals, maybe deer, but the pattern didn't make sense. The breaks were at a human height, and the force seemed deliberate. My pace quickened, partly out of fatigue, partly out of growing anxiety. As darkness approached, I realized I was running out of daylight faster than I had anticipated. My map indicated a small ridge that I could use as a temporary campsite, but it was still a few miles away. The trail became less defined, almost disappearing in some areas under snow and fallen branches. I was concentrating so hard on my footing that I didn't notice the distant sound at first. Snapping twigs, faint at first, then growing slightly louder, consistent like footsteps. I froze. The sound didn't match mine. It wasn't my echo. It was deliberate enough to suggest someone was following me. My pulse quickened, and I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was another hiker who had camped nearby, maybe someone else on the trail. I paused and listened carefully. The sound stopped when I stopped, and when I moved again, it resumed. I started walking faster, trying to get to the ridge before nightfall. Night fell faster than I expected, and I had to use my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating jagged rocks and twisted roots. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. My mind raced, thinking of all the worst-case scenarios. I had heard stories of hikers getting lost and attacked in remote areas, but I had always dismissed them as sensationalized. Now, alone in the dark, the reality felt closer than ever. I finally reached the ridge, a narrow stretch of flat ground surrounded by steep slopes. I set up my tent quickly, trying not to make noise. Every sound I made, the rustling of fabric, the hammering of stakes, felt amplified in the still night. I made a small fire, enough to keep me warm and provide some light. The warmth of the flames helped calm me slightly, but the feeling of being watched never left. I lay in my sleeping bag, flashlight nearby, listening intently. Hours passed. The forest was alive with nocturnal sounds. Owl calls, the rustle of small animals. But the footsteps never came close enough for me to confirm if anyone was near. Occasionally, I thought I heard movement just outside the tent. subtle enough to make my heart race. I didn't sleep much that night, barely dozing, too alert to close my eyes fully. Morning came, pale and gray. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the ridge. The sun barely penetrated the thick forest canopy, and the trail seemed even more treacherous in daylight. I descended slowly, careful of ice and loose rocks. That's when I realized something alarming. My water bottle, which I had kept full the night before, was nearly empty. I hadn't drunk enough the day before, and the thought of being dehydrated added urgency to my hike. By midday, I noticed more signs. Branches bent, footprints again, deeper and closer than before. I kept moving but avoided the larger areas of snow, which would leave obvious tracks. The anxiety was gnawing at me, but I forced myself to stay rational. I reminded myself I had gear, food, water, and a map. I just needed to keep going. Late afternoon, I reached a point where the trail forked. My map indicated the left fork led down to a road I could reach by evening, while the right fork went deeper into the mountains. I chose the left, but almost immediately the trail became a maze of fallen trees and thick underbrush. My pace slowed, and I had to scramble over rocks and crawl under branches. The sun was beginning to dip, and I realized I might have miscalculated my path. The fear of night falling again in unfamiliar terrain made my chest tighten. Then I heard it. The footsteps again, closer now, crunching over dead leaves and small rocks. I stopped, frozen, straining my ears. They weren't constant, but intermittent, always following the same rhythm, as if someone was waiting for the right moment to close in. I started walking faster, trying not to run, knowing a fall on the rocky slope could be fatal. The noise followed. In desperation, I remembered a trick I had read about in survival guides: changing direction and using natural obstacles. I veered off the trail slightly, moving along a narrow ridge with steep drops to either side, hoping the terrain would slow anyone following me. I kept low, crawling in some places, and finally stumbled upon a small, shallow cave in the cliffside. It wasn't more than a few feet deep, but it offered concealment. I crawled inside, pressed myself against the wall, and stayed silent. Time passed slowly. I could hear distant sounds outside, branches breaking, leaves rustling. But eventually, the footsteps stopped. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. The light outside faded, leaving only the faint glow of the moon through the trees. Eventually, the forest returned to normal nighttime sounds, and I assumed whoever or whatever was following me had moved on. I waited until full darkness, then carefully started descending again. I kept to the ridge, moving as silently as possible, until the trail finally opened onto a small dirt road. Relief flooded me. I had no cell service, but I could see tire tracks and signs of human activity. I walked along the road until I reached a small parking area, where a lone car was parked. Exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken, I realized I had survived something I couldn't fully explain. The trail that had seemed so serene in daylight had turned into a test of endurance and instinct. Eventually, I found a ranger station a few miles down the road. I explained my situation, though I didn't mention the footprints or the feeling of being followed. They would have thought I was imagining things. They confirmed the trail was remote, and few hikers attempted it alone, especially this early in the season. I rested, drank water, and allowed myself to process what had happened. It took me weeks to shake the sense of unease completely. Even now, months later, I avoid that section of the mountains. The experience taught me that nature can be unpredictable, and that danger doesn't always come from animals or weather. Sometimes it comes from the unknown presence of another human. I survived that. I had always considered myself experienced when it came to hiking. I wasn't one of those people who went out for a leisurely walk and called it an adventure. I had done multi-day hikes, rough terrain, unpredictable weather. I had done it all, or so I thought. That confidence, that overestimation of my own abilities, is what put me in the situation I ended up in. It started as a simple plan: a solo hike in a section of the forest that was remote but technically accessible, a trail that wasn't well marked but was known among serious hikers. It promised isolation, the kind of solitude that made people think they were one with nature. I thought I could handle it. I thought I knew what I was getting into. I started early in the morning, when the sky was still a pale gray, and the first light was filtering through the dense canopy of trees. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was the usual rustle of leaves underfoot, the occasional bird call, but other than that, the silence was heavy, oppressive. I felt good, though. I was carrying enough water, food, and gear to last 2 days, and I had made sure my phone was fully charged. I had a compass, a map, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small first aid kit. I checked everything twice before starting, walking in a brisk rhythm, feeling the familiar satisfaction of being alone in the wild. The trail began as a dirt path, clear enough to follow easily. Fallen leaves covered the ground in shades of brown and gold. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of pine and damp soil. I moved steadily, noting the small details of the forest, the way the morning light caught on wet leaves, the shadows of branches creating patterns on the ground, the occasional squirrel darting up a tree. It was peaceful, almost mesmerizing, the kind of peace that made you forget everything else in the world. After about 2 hours of hiking, the trail began to narrow. The trees grew closer together, and the undergrowth became thicker. I had to duck under low branches and step over roots that jutted out from the ground. The sounds of the forest seemed to amplify. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf echoing strangely in the stillness. I passed a small creek, its water running clear over smooth stones. I paused for a moment to drink, crouching down and filling my bottle, listening to the sound of water. It was refreshing, and I felt invigorated, ready for whatever came next. As the morning turned into afternoon, the path became less obvious. The trail markers were few and far between, faded and hard to see. I relied heavily on my map and compass, double-checking my bearings at every turn. The terrain became steeper, with loose rocks and patches of mud making each step a careful calculation. The sun was higher now, filtering through the treetops in streaks of light, and the heat was starting to build. I was sweating, my shirt sticking to my back, but I didn't mind. I liked the physical challenge. It was around midday when I noticed something strange. The forest, which had been quiet in a pleasant way, now felt almost too quiet. There were no birds, no insects, no movement at all except for the occasional leaf drifting to the ground. The wind had died down, leaving the air heavy and still. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a part of the forest, that sometimes nature goes silent. I pressed on, keeping my pace steady, but I started paying closer attention to every sound, every shadow. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. The trail I was on no longer matched the map exactly. The landmarks I had been using didn't line up, and the small creek I expected to cross had disappeared. I double-checked my compass. My heading was correct, but the terrain around me didn't make sense. Trees were denser here, and the ground was uneven, covered in thick roots and rocks. I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. I wasn't lost yet, not completely, but I could feel the margin for error shrinking. Every step had to be deliberate. I stopped to rest, sitting on a fallen log and taking out my water bottle. I tried to think logically. If I retraced my steps, I might find the correct path again. But retracing was risky. The undergrowth was dense, and I could lose the trail entirely. I weighed my options. I could continue forward using my compass and map as best I could, or I could backtrack carefully. I decided to move forward, trusting my instincts and the compass, but I kept a mental note to be ready to turn back if the terrain became too dangerous. The afternoon passed slowly. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning constantly for any sign of a path. The forest was oppressive now, the canopy blocking most of the sunlight. Shadows lengthened, and the air cooled, carrying a faint dampness that clung to my skin. Every sound seemed magnified. The snap of a branch underfoot, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves that might have been caused by the wind or something else. I tried not to think about what that something else could be. Around late afternoon, I found a small clearing. It was barely more than a break in the trees, maybe 20 feet across, but it gave me a sense of relief. I could see the sky above, the last golden light filtering through the branches. I decided to stop here for a longer break, to rest and eat something. I pulled out my granola bar and water, sitting on a rock at the edge of the clearing. The forest around me was quiet again, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I laughed at myself for thinking that. I was alone, no one else was here, and the only creatures in the forest were small animals. Still, the feeling persisted. I finished my snack quickly and packed everything back into my backpack. I had to keep moving. I resumed hiking, and that's when the real difficulty began. The trail completely disappeared in places, replaced by a chaotic jumble of roots, rocks, and fallen trees. I had to climb over logs and squeeze through thickets, every step taking more effort than the last. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from carrying the pack, but I kept pushing forward. The light was fading fast, and I knew I had to find a suitable spot to set up camp before nightfall. As the sun dipped lower, I realized I was running out of time. The forest was a maze now, every tree looking the same, every path indistinguishable from the next. I slowed down, scanning the ground for any flat area that could serve as a campsite. I found a small patch of relatively level ground near a large rock formation and decided to settle there. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best I could do. I dropped my pack, pulled out my tent, and began the process of setting it up. My hands were shaking slightly, whether from exhaustion or anxiety, I wasn't sure. By the time the tent was set up, the last light had vanished, leaving me in near total darkness. I used my flashlight to illuminate the area, placing it on a rock so I could continue unpacking and preparing. I had water, food, and a small stove, but the forest felt entirely different at night. Every sound was amplified, the rustling of leaves, the creak of branches, the distant call of an animal. I tried to focus on the practical tasks, cooking a simple meal, checking my gear, making sure the tent was secure. My mind refused to stop racing, though, constantly replaying the moments when I had been unsure of the trail, when I had felt that oppressive silence. That night, sleep was elusive. Every noise startled me. A branch snapping nearby made me jump, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, but the fear persisted. I stayed awake for hours, listening to the forest, my flashlight off to conserve battery, my hands resting on my backpack in case I needed to move quickly. The air was cold, and I shivered under my sleeping bag, trying to will myself to rest. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, full of restless dreams filled with shadows and strange movements. I woke early, before dawn, to the sound of something moving outside the tent. My heart raced. I listened carefully. There were small noises, footsteps, something brushing against leaves. I couldn't see through the thick fabric of the tent, but I remained still, holding my breath. After a few minutes, the noises faded, leaving only the natural sounds of the forest awakening. I convinced myself it had been an animal, nothing more, and forced myself to get up. I packed quickly, my anxiety pushing me to move faster than I probably should have. The morning was thick with fog, reducing visibility to just a few feet. I tried to follow the compass and map again, but everything looked the same. Trees loomed out of the fog like silent sentinels, roots and rocks hidden beneath the mist making every step precarious. I slipped once on wet mud, catching myself just in time on a tree trunk. My muscles ached, my mind was fraying, but I kept going. I had to find the main trail, or I could be trapped in this maze of forest indefinitely. Hours passed. The fog lifted slightly, revealing more of the terrain, but it also revealed the extent of my disorientation. I realized I had walked in a large circle over. I had been planning this hike for months, obsessively checking maps, reading trail reports, and watching videos from people who had tackled the same area. It was a remote trail in the mountains that few people ever visited, which appealed to me because I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect, and a real challenge. The thought of rugged terrain, sharp ridges, dense forests, and sheer cliffs made me nervous, but I was confident in my preparation. I had the proper gear: A sturdy backpack, waterproof boots, warm clothing layered for the unpredictable mountain weather, a first aid kit, a reliable compass, a GPS device, enough food for several days, and a couple of liters of water. I told no one exactly where I was going beyond a vague reference to the range and left early in the morning when the sun was barely breaking the horizon, casting a soft orange glow over the valley below. The first hours were straightforward. The trailhead was quiet, surrounded by towering pine and spruce trees that filtered the sunlight into green-gold shafts. The air was sharp, clean, and carried the faint smell of wet earth and pine needles. I moved at a steady pace, savoring the rhythm of walking, the quiet punctuated only by birds and the occasional distant rustle of an unseen animal. The path was narrow, with roots weaving across it like natural tripwires, and the occasional fallen branch that forced me to step carefully. I had started with a light pack to keep my balance on tricky sections, but even so, I was aware of how quickly the energy drained from the body when hiking uphill with weight. I made sure to drink water at regular intervals and to eat small snacks, nuts and dried fruit to keep my stamina up. By mid-morning, the trail began to incline sharply, the forest thinning to make way for jagged rock faces. The scent of pine faded, replaced by the harsher, metallic smell of mineral-laden soil. Small streams trickled down from higher elevations, their water clear and cold, tumbling over mossy stones. I stopped to fill my bottle, enjoying the quiet gurgle of the water. The trail became trickier here, requiring careful navigation over loose gravel and uneven surfaces. Every step had to be deliberate. I reminded myself to breathe steadily, keeping my heart rate manageable, but I couldn't ignore the tight knot of tension in my stomach that had been there since I left the trailhead. By noon, I reached a plateau with a partial view of the valley far below. The wind had picked up, sudden gusts that made the jagged rocks beneath my boots slick with fine dust and sand. I took a break, sitting on a flat boulder, scanning the terrain ahead. The path was barely visible from this vantage point, a thin line snaking along the side of the mountain, shadowed by steep drops. My excitement and sense of adventure were tinged with unease. I was alone, far from help, and the trail, while marked on maps, offered little in the way of safety measures. There were no handrails, no barriers, just sheer rock faces and the constant risk of a misstep. I shook my head and focused on eating, hydrating, and mentally preparing for the next section. The hours after the plateau were slow and tense. The trail narrowed even further, sometimes reduced to a single track carved into the rock. On one side, the mountain rose sharply. On the other, it dropped away into dizzying heights. Every careful step required full attention, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of navigating these precarious ledges. My boots crunched on loose stones, and every shift of my weight made me hyper-aware of the precariousness beneath my feet. I moved deliberately, testing each foothold before committing my weight, gripping rocks and tree roots for balance. The wind was relentless, rattling loose stones and whipping through the narrow canyon-like sections with an eerie intensity. I knew that if a strong gust caught me at the wrong angle, I could lose my footing in an instant. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather, dark and ominous, curling around the peaks above. The temperature dropped, and a light drizzle began to fall, soaking my clothing and making the rocks slicker. I tightened my pack straps, pulled my waterproof jacket over my layers, and continued, though the climb had become slower, more exhausting. Visibility was decreasing, and I had to rely increasingly on my compass and GPS. The trail twisted unpredictably, sometimes disappearing into dense patches of scrub and small trees clinging to the mountain, forcing me to carefully scan the terrain for safe footing. I felt the first real sense of fear creeping in, the type that wasn't dramatic but insistent, a gnawing awareness of just how exposed I was and how quickly a misstep could escalate into disaster. Then I heard it, the sound of a landslide, or at least the unmistakable rumble of rock shifting far above me. My heart jumped. I froze in place, scanning upward, and saw a small cascade of stones falling along a ridge several meters away. The sound of tumbling rock echoed down the slopes, a sharp, frightening percussion. My pulse surged, I realized that even one miscalculation could bring debris down onto the narrow trail. I retreated slightly, seeking a safer section of rock to steady myself. I waited, listening. After a tense minute, the noise ceased. I continued, now moving slower, more deliberately than ever, aware that the mountain was not passive. It could move against me without warning. By late afternoon, I reached a section where the trail split. One path followed a ledge that hugged the cliffside, exposed and narrow, while the other cut into a shallow gully between jagged outcrops, cluttered with fallen branches and loose stones. I knew from my map that the ledge was more direct, but also far riskier in wet conditions. My shoes were soaked, my energy low, and the drizzle had become steady, chilling through even my waterproof layers. I chose the gully, thinking that some shelter from wind and a slightly wider path would be safer. Immediately, I regretted it. The trail was treacherous, slippery with mud and loose debris, and every step required careful balancing. I slid once, catching myself on a low rock just before my body would have gone tumbling forward. My heart hammered in my chest, sweat and rain mixing on my face. I forced myself to calm down, reminding myself that panicked movements were what caused real accidents. Evening came, dimming the world to a gray wash of rock and mist. I knew I had to find a place to camp soon. The trail became impossible to continue after a point, narrowing into a ridge that disappeared into shadow and fog. There were no flat surfaces suitable for pitching a tent, only jagged rocks, steep drops, and scattered boulders. I descended into a small clearing tucked between two rock faces. It was muddy, uneven, but the only option for the night. I set my backpack down, checked my supplies, and began preparing a makeshift campsite. I cleared some rocks and mud to create a relatively level area for my sleeping pad and bivy sack, securing everything with heavy stones. I ate a small meal of dehydrated food mixed with water, the warm mush a comfort against the cold, damp air. The rain continued, pattering on the rocks and dripping from overhanging branches, chilling my clothes and equipment. Night fell completely, and with it came an oppressive darkness. I could hear the wind funneling through the rock faces, carrying distant echoes of branches snapping, stones clattering down the slopes, and the faint calls of nocturnal animals. I tried to focus on resting, knowing that sleep was essential, but every noise seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the mountain around me, imagining worst-case scenarios, visualizing what could happen if I slipped, if a rockfall occurred, if the rain worsened. The fear was rational, grounded in the precariousness of my position, but it was relentless. Around midnight, the wind picked up violently, whipping rain sideways across the clearing. My bivy sack provided some protection, but water seeped in through tiny gaps, soaking my clothes and gear. I hugged my knees to conserve warmth, feeling the cold bite at my fingers and toes. Then came the sound of rocks shifting above me, larger and closer than before. My heart leapt. I crawled as far as I could against the rock face, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and potential falling debris. A small rock tumbled down, striking my backpack with a sharp thud, bouncing and rolling down the slope. I froze, breathing shallowly, waiting for the next one. Several stones followed, clattering down past me in a terrifying, unpredictable rhythm. I realized I couldn't stay here safely for much longer. At first light, I assessed the situation. My campsite was unstable, and the rain had made the trail ahead slippery and dangerous. I had to move. I packed what I could, carefully wrapping wet gear to protect it, and began retracing my path to a more stable section of the trail. The rocks were slick, and my boots slipped once or twice, but I managed to keep my balance by moving slowly, deliberately, and testing each step. The trail seemed longer and steeper than the day before, and I realized how much energy I had expended fighting fear as well as gravity. I had been planning this hike for months. Not a simple day hike or a trail in the park. This was going to be a solo expedition deep into the mountains, somewhere I could be entirely alone, somewhere untouched. I didn't want anyone else there, The idea of solitude was intoxicating, and for weeks I pored over maps, trail reports, and satellite images. Finally, I settled on a stretch of trail that was known for being difficult, unmaintained, and rarely traveled. It promised steep climbs, dense forests, and rugged terrain. It was perfect. I left early in the morning when the sky was still gray with dawn, carrying a large pack loaded with all the essentials: water, food, extra clothes, first aid, navigation tools, and a small sleeping bag in case I couldn't make it back before nightfall. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet pine and earth. The trailhead was quiet, deserted. Even the usual sounds of birds seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The first few hours were easy. The trail wound upward through thick undergrowth, but the path was still visible. My boots crunched over fallen leaves and loose stones, and I could hear the distant rush of a stream. I passed a few broken markers, barely standing, their paint faded and peeling. I knew from my research that these signs were unreliable, that people often lost the trail here. I stayed vigilant, checking my compass frequently, cross-referencing it with the map. By mid-morning, the trail became steeper. The incline was relentless, and the forest grew thicker, darker. Sunlight barely pierced the canopy. Roots snaked across the path, threatening to trip me at every step. I paused occasionally to drink water and catch my breath, feeling the burn in my legs and lungs. The silence was profound. I realized I hadn't seen anyone since leaving the trailhead, and that was both exhilarating and unnerving. The further I climbed, the more I could feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me. Around noon, I came to a point where the trail split into two unmarked directions. According to my map, the left path should have led me higher into the mountain, following a ridge that promised views I wanted. The right path was less steep, winding through a valley below, but it appeared overgrown and unkempt. I decided to take the left path, confident that I could manage the climb. The trail soon became treacherous. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and I had to use my hands to balance myself along narrow stretches. At one point, I reached a small clearing with jagged rocks protruding from the earth. I paused to catch my breath and drink water, leaning against a boulder that was cool and damp. I noticed small markings on the rocks, scratches that didn't look natural, as if someone or something had carved them. My stomach tightened with unease. It was the first sign that I might not be as alone as I thought. As I continued, the path grew less distinct. Roots and fallen branches blocked my way, and I had to force myself through thickets. My progress slowed, and I began to notice strange sounds. The crack of twigs snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves where no wind should be. I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, deer, or perhaps a fox, but the noises were too deliberate, too precise. My heart began to race, but I pressed on, telling myself I was being paranoid. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had been walking for hours without seeing a landmark that matched my map. I stopped and spread the map across a flat rock, tracing my path. My compass read north, and my map indicated I should be nearing a ridge, but all I could see were trees, rocks, and a vague slope. Panic rose in my chest. I was lost. I had prepared for this, carried all the right tools, but nothing matched what I expected. The sun was dropping lower, and shadows stretched long and jagged across the forest floor. I decided to backtrack to the last recognizable marker, but as I retraced my steps, I realized the path I had come from seemed subtly different, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. Rocks that had been on my left were now on my right. A small stream that should have crossed the trail was nowhere to be found. My mind tried to rationalize it, but I couldn't. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. The air grew colder, damp, and sharp with the scent of wet stone and decaying leaves. I tried to stay calm, moving carefully, marking the trees with pieces of cloth torn from my shirt so I could track my path. Hours passed. The sky darkened to a muted gray, and the forest was almost pitch black under the thick canopy. My energy was fading, my legs trembling from exhaustion. I realized I hadn't eaten in hours, and my water supply was low. I knew I had to find a safe place to rest, or I might not make it through the night. Eventually, I came across a narrow ledge along the side of the mountain, partially sheltered by overhanging rock. It was small, barely enough to stretch out, but it would protect me from the wind. I unpacked my sleeping bag and settled in, my body shaking from cold and fatigue. I ate a small portion of my food and sipped water slowly. Outside, the forest was alive with strange noises. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. But none of it felt natural anymore. Something in me told me to be alert, to watch, but I was too drained to argue. I spent a long, restless night on that ledge, listening, imagining shapes in the darkness that weren't really there. I couldn't sleep more than a few minutes at a time, every sound making me flinch. Dawn was a relief, a faint gray light filtering through the canopy, giving me enough visibility to plan my next move. I realized I had no choice but to descend. The ridge I had intended to climb was lost to me, and staying put was not safe. I packed quickly, keeping close to the edge of the ledge to avoid slipping, and began a careful descent. The slope below was steep, covered with loose rocks and thick underbrush. I moved slowly, testing each foothold. My muscles ached from the previous day's climb, but fear sharpened my focus. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every rustle made my heart leap. I stumbled once and slid down a few feet, catching myself on a tree trunk. My hands were scratched and bleeding, but I kept going. Hours later, I stumbled upon a small stream. I was relieved. Water was a lifeline, and streams often led to trails or signs of civilization. I followed it downstream, careful to keep my balance on slippery rocks. By late morning, I began to notice faint signs of human activity. Broken branches laid across the forest floor, remnants of an old trail, a plastic bottle partially buried in mud. My hope surged. I was no longer completely lost. Eventually, after hours of careful navigation, I emerged from the dense forest onto a wider, clearer path. It wasn't the trailhead I had started from, but it was unmistakably a trail. Footprints were visible in the mud, recent ones, probably from hikers earlier in the week. I followed the path downhill, and by mid-afternoon, I reached a ranger station at the edge of the forest. Exhausted, filthy, and hungry, I finally had safety. The experience left me shaken. I had been prepared, experienced, and cautious, yet the mountain had thrown me into a disorienting nightmare. I realized how fragile control is in the wilderness, how easily the mind can be overwhelmed by isolation, fatigue, and the unknown. I had survived, but the memory of that dark forest, the twisting, unmarked paths, and the suffocating solitude would stay with me forever. After a long shower, warm food, and a place to rest, I recounted the experience in my journal. I drew maps, described the landmarks, and noted the points where I had felt most lost. I never wanted to forget the lessons I had learned, the importance of constant vigilance, the humility of being alone in the wilderness, and the raw, unpredictable power of nature. Weeks later, I returned to the mountains, but never to that trail. I stuck to marked paths, trails maintained and patrolled, the ones familiar to other hikers. But every time I closed my eyes at night, I could see that ledge, hear the snapping branches, feel the darkness pressing down on me. It had been terrifying, but I survived, and in surviving, I learned something vital. Respect for the wilderness isn't just about knowledge or preparation. It's about understanding your own limits, your own vulnerability, and the quiet, persistent danger that exists even in a forest that seems still. I had been planning the hike for months, watching maps, reading trail guides, and checking weather patterns. I wanted a challenge, a long, isolated trail that few people attempted. That summer, I found a trail that wound through a dense forested range, rising into steep hills and rocky outcrops. The trailhead was almost 2 hours from the nearest town, a place so remote that the mobile signal disappeared as soon as you left the road. I told myself that the isolation was part of the appeal, that this was the kind of hike where I could test my limits and immerse myself fully in nature. I packed carefully. My backpack was heavy with essentials. Plenty of water, high-calorie food, first aid kit, flashlight with extra batteries, rope, a compass, map, and a small multi-tool. I wore sturdy boots, thick socks, and layers of clothing suitable for the sudden shifts in mountain weather. I left the trailhead at dawn, when the mist still clung to the forest floor, and the air smelled damp and earthy. The first few hours were beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, and the sound of birds punctuated the quiet. I walked briskly, following the trail markers carved into tree trunks and painted on rocks, confident in my navigation skills. By mid-morning, I had already crossed a small stream and climbed the first steep slope. My legs ached slightly, but I didn't mind. Hiking alone meant I could move at my own pace, stop when I needed, and take the trail in fully. I stopped briefly to drink water, leaning against a thick pine tree. That was when I first noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft mud along the trail. They were not human. I examined them carefully. They were large, wider than a man's foot, with deep impressions as if something heavy had pressed into the ground. The toes weren't human either, more like a paw, but larger than any dog or wolf I had ever seen. I froze, staring at the prints. My heart beat faster, not out of fear but curiosity. I followed the trail a little further, my eyes scanning for signs of the animal. The prints disappeared after a bend, and the forest returned to its usual quiet. I shook my head. Maybe a bear, I thought. Not unusual for this area. I continued, trying not to dwell on the tracks. The trail steepened, weaving through dense underbrush and rocky paths. Around noon, I stopped on a flat outcrop to eat a snack and rest. The view was incredible. The valley below was dotted with rivers that glinted in the sunlight, and the hills stretched into the horizon, layered in green and gold. I felt a strange sense of freedom, an isolation so complete that it almost felt like stepping into another world. But I also noticed how quiet it had become. No birds, no rustling in the trees, no wind, just the faint sound of my own breathing. After eating, I pushed on. The trail became narrower, and the trees older, their trunks thick and twisted. Fallen branches littered the path, and moss covered the rocks, making every step cautious. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a section where the trail followed a ridge. One side dropped sharply into a rocky canyon. The other climbed gradually into thicker forest. I walked carefully, holding onto roots and rocks to stabilize myself. Then I noticed it again. A sound, faint but distinct. A low, steady thump, like heavy footsteps, moving parallel to my path but just out of sight. I froze, listening. The sound stopped when I stopped. I waited for several minutes, heart pounding, but nothing emerged from the trees. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks. Still, the feeling of being watched settled in my chest like a weight. I decided to keep moving, faster now, scanning the forest on either side. The ridge ended, and the trail descended into a thick grove of conifers. The ground was softer here, covered in needles, and my boots sank slightly with each step. I noticed more prints, this time fresher. They were the same as before, large, heavy, not human. They crisscrossed the trail, sometimes leading into the undergrowth, sometimes following it. I didn't want to panic, but a knot of fear twisted in my stomach. I increased my pace, gripping my flashlight and multi-tool in my hands, though it was still daylight. By late afternoon, I reached a small stream that crossed the trail. I knelt to drink, splashing cold water on my face. The sun was starting to sink, and the forest began to change color, shadows stretching and shifting. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The prints were still here, crossing the stream, leading deeper into the forest. Whatever had made them had been following me, or at least moving along the same trail. I felt trapped. Turning back would be dangerous too. The trail was steep and treacherous, and I had already come so far. I pressed on, trying to keep calm. Soon, I reached a clearing where the trail leveled slightly, and I considered making camp. The day had been long, and I was tired, my legs aching from constant climbing. I found a small patch of flat ground near some trees and rocks, enough space for my sleeping mat and gear. As I unpacked, I kept glancing at the forest edge. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the silence. I tried to convince myself it was just the forest, birds settling in, wind through the leaves. I ate a small dinner, drank water, and made sure my flashlight and rope were easily accessible. I slept lightly that night, every snap of a twig sending my heart into my throat. Morning came in a gray, misty haze. I packed quickly and resumed the trail. The prints were everywhere now, crisscrossing the path, heading in the same direction. I noticed something else too. Trees that had been broken or scratched, marks on the bark that suggested an enormous animal had passed. The rational part of me said bear, but the size didn't add up. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had made the prints had the strength to crush a human, and it had been moving silently alongside me. By noon, I reached a small ridge overlooking a narrow valley. The trail descended sharply, and the rocks were slick from morning dew. I moved carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. That's when I saw it. Not clearly, but enough to make me freeze. A massive shape, darker than the forest, moving through the trees below, just out of sight, but unmistakable. It wasn't running. It wasn't chasing. It was following, always keeping a distance, shadowing my path through the trees. My pulse raced. Every survival instinct screamed at me to retreat, but the trail didn't offer an easy way back, and the shape stayed below, hidden in shadows. I decided to push on, moving faster, eyes darting constantly. I took care to stay on the trail, avoiding underbrush and loose rocks. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Each bend in the trail, each ridge I crossed, the shape remained, keeping a distance, silent but present. I rationed my water, knowing I might be out here for hours. My legs burned, my back ached from the pack, my hands scraped from gripping roots and rocks, but I could not stop. By late afternoon, I reached a part of the trail that ran along the side of a cliff. The drop was sheer, the rocks jagged and dangerous. My boots slipped several times, and I had to cling to roots and ledges to maintain balance. Below, the forest stretched into a green sea, and I glimpsed the shape again, moving steadily among the trees. I realized then that it had been following me all along, not attacking, just tracking. My mind raced with possibilities. Bear, wildcat, some unknown animal. But fear and exhaustion made reasoning difficult. The sun was low now, casting long shadows. I spotted a series of switchbacks leading down to a lower section of the trail that I recognized from the map. I forced myself to move slowly but steadily, testing each step, holding onto rocks and roots, breathing heavily. The shape below seemed to sense I was approaching a more open area. It paused occasionally, as if studying me. I kept my multi-tool in hand, ready, though I knew it was useless against something this large. Eventually, I reached the bottom of the ridge and a wider, flatter section of trail. Relief surged through me, though my legs trembled from fatigue. I took a long drink of water, and that's when I noticed something. The prints stopped. The last set led to a thick clump of trees and then vanished. I scanned the forest, heart pounding, but the shape was gone. Silence returned, heavy and complete, broken only by distant bird calls and the rustle of leaves. I walked carefully, still alert, but the tension began to ease. I reached a stream where I could refill my water bottles and rest. I sat for a long while, leaning against a tree, muscles stiff, mind racing. I realized that the animal had not attacked me, had only observed, perhaps curious or cautious, but I had no proof of its intentions. Whatever it had been, it was powerful, intelligent, and perfectly adapted to the forest. By evening, I reached a trail junction that led back toward civilization. I had always loved hiking, the quiet isolation of the trails, the smell of damp earth, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the distant call of birds. That morning, I left my apartment with a heavy backpack, full of supplies, expecting nothing more than another long, solitary hike in the mountains that rose sharply outside my town. The sky was overcast, the clouds low, dark, and threatening rain, but I didn't mind. I had hiked in worse weather before. The trailhead was nearly empty, save for a couple of cars parked far off in the lot. I tightened the straps of my pack and set off, boots crunching on the gravel. The path quickly narrowed into a single track winding into the dense forest. Pine and spruce towers loomed overhead, their needles forming a thick carpet underfoot, muting my steps. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint smell of moss and rotting wood. I breathed deeply, savoring the crisp forest air, unaware of the tension that would slowly creep into every step I took that day. At first, the hike was uneventful. I kept a steady pace, my legs moving on autopilot, my mind wandering through the familiar rhythm of walking, breathing, and listening. Occasionally, I paused to admire the view through gaps in the trees, valleys stretching below, rivers glinting like silver threads. Birds darted between branches, and somewhere nearby, water trickled over rocks in a small stream. After about 2 hours, the path began to climb sharply. Roots and rocks forced careful footing. My breathing grew heavier, sweat soaking the back of my shirt despite the chill in the air. I felt a strange sense of isolation begin to settle in. The forest, dense and quiet, had swallowed all signs of human presence. No distant voices, no cars, no laughter, only the sound of my own movement. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the exertion and the shadows playing tricks in the overcast light. By the time I reached the ridge, clouds had thickened, turning the light to a dull gray. I stopped to rest, leaning on my hiking poles, drinking water, and scanning the valley below. Everything looked the same, familiar but eerily quiet. I had expected some hikers to be on the trail, someone in the distance, a bird startled into flight, but the forest seemed abandoned. I continued along the ridge. The trail became less defined, narrower, with jagged rocks jutting from the earth and tangled roots threatening to trip me with every step. My pack felt heavier with each hour. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I registered that the air felt colder, the light dimmer, but I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I just needed to keep moving. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. A signpost stood crooked and weathered. One path led down into a shadowed valley. The other continued along the ridge, which appeared even steeper and rockier. I chose the ridge, thinking it would give better views and be easier to navigate than descending into thick shadows. Looking back, that decision would haunt me more than any thought of ghosts ever could. The ridge was treacherous. Loose stones crunched underfoot, and steep drops lined the side. I had to concentrate on every step, sometimes using my hands to steady myself against rocks. The wind picked up, cold and biting, whipping at my jacket, making the loose branches sway and creak. With each gust, the ridge felt more precarious, more exposed. I kept moving, reminding myself that I had been on challenging trails before. I was strong, careful, prepared. As I climbed higher, the clouds descended further, thick and gray, reducing visibility to a few meters. The world beyond the ridge vanished into a blur of white and gray. The trail became less obvious, the rocks slick with moisture, and a growing unease settled in my chest. I began noticing the silence in a new way. No birds, no wind rustling the trees below, only the sound of my own breathing and the occasional small rock tumbling down the slope. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a section of the trail that required careful scrambling over steep, jagged rocks. My hands were scraped and bleeding, my knees bruised, but I kept going. I could feel fatigue creeping in, every muscle in my body screaming for a break. My legs trembled, my heart raced, yet I pressed on, unwilling to stop when the summit seemed so close. It was then I noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the mud near a pool of water collected between the rocks. They were human, fresh, pointing back down the ridge. My heart skipped. It wasn't unusual to see other hikers, but the prints were large, heavy, and deep. Someone much bigger than me had passed here, alone. A chill ran down my spine. I rationalized it. Maybe it was just a hiker ahead of me turned back, or maybe someone had camped here recently. I shook my head, trying to focus, but I couldn't help feeling like the forest had grown more oppressive. The wind rose sharply, howling across the ridge. Dark clouds pressed down from above, and I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. My fingers and toes grew numb, despite gloves and thick socks. I considered turning back, but the ridge seemed endless, and descending would require retracing the dangerous path I had already climbed. My sense of direction wavered under the gray haze. I pressed on. Hours passed, though I had lost track of time. The trail seemed endless, winding up jagged rocks, over ridges, and along narrow ledges with sheer drops. My legs were weak, my hands raw from clutching the rocks. Every shadow seemed heavier, every sound amplified. Rocks shifting under my feet sounded like avalanches, branches breaking in the distance like something moving just beyond sight. I kept moving, forcing myself to focus on one step at a time. By late afternoon, the storm began in earnest. Rain started as a fine mist, turning quickly into a driving downpour. The rocks became slick, and water pooled in the shallow depressions along the trail. My pack absorbed some of the rain despite being waterproof, and my clothes became soaked, clinging uncomfortably to my skin. The wind howled, threatening to knock me off balance, and my hands were numb, making it difficult to grasp my hiking poles. I realized I had underestimated the ridge. It was no longer a trail. It was a perilous path along sheer rock faces, with drops on either side. One misstep could mean a fall that no one could survive. Fear gripped me, tight and choking, yet I had no choice but to continue. Turning back would be nearly impossible in the storm, the ridge slick and treacherous behind me. Then I noticed it, a small rock ledge jutting out over a steep drop. It was barely wide enough for my boots. I tested it carefully, feeling it shift slightly under my weight. My stomach twisted with fear. One wrong move and I could tumble down hundreds of feet. But there was no alternative. The trail vanished behind me into mist and rain, and ahead was the only way forward, a thin line of wet stone clinging to the mountain. I moved slowly, one careful step at a time, heart hammering in my chest. Rain stung my face and my vision blurred. A rock beneath my left foot shifted, and I nearly lost my balance. My hands scrabbled for purchase, scraping again, blood mixing with rain. My heart raced, adrenaline surging. I forced myself to breathe, slow and controlled, focusing only on the next step, the next secure handhold. It felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes, before the ridge widened slightly, giving a small reprieve. I collapsed against a rock, gasping, body trembling from exhaustion and fear. My clothes were soaked, my hands cut and bleeding, and my muscles ached with the strain of the climb. The storm continued, though slightly less intense, and I realized I was completely alone. No one else was on this ridge. No one could help me if I fell. The isolation, the raw danger, made my chest tighten with anxiety. Eventually, the ridge ended at a small plateau, partially protected by a natural overhang. I collapsed again, leaning against the rock, trying to recover. I realized I had been hiking for nearly 12 hours since leaving the trailhead. My water was low, my energy nearly gone, and I knew I had to find shelter or a way down before nightfall. The storm continued to lash the mountain, and I knew descending in the dark, on slick rocks, could be fatal. I scanned the area and spotted a narrow gully leading down from the plateau. It looked dangerous, but less so than continuing along the ridge in the storm. Carefully, I navigated the descent, sliding and scrambling over wet rocks, testing each foothold before committing weight. My muscles screamed in protest, my fingers numb and slick, but I refused to stop until I reached more stable ground. Hours later, exhausted, battered, and drenched, I finally reached the base of the mountain. The storm had eased, and the forest looked less menacing in the dim evening light. I collapsed near a stream, water flowing past my boots, and allowed I never thought a hike could turn into something that would haunt me for months afterward. I had always considered myself careful, prepared, and logical. Hiking was my escape, my way to disconnect from the chaos of work, people, and city life. The mountain I chose that day was somewhere I had never been, far from the usual trails I frequented. It was called Black Pine Ridge. On the map, it didn't look particularly treacherous, but it promised isolation, long stretches of unbroken forest, and a ridge that cut through the peaks like a jagged knife. I liked that. I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted quiet. I started early in the morning, just as the sun was touching the tips of the trees with golden light. The air was crisp, cold enough to make my lungs feel clean and open. My pack was heavy but balanced, filled with water, food, a first aid kit, extra clothing, and a flashlight just in case. I wore a thick jacket, hiking boots that had seen better days, and gloves that were already fraying at the fingertips. The trailhead was quiet, almost eerily so. No cars in the lot, no other hikers, just the sound of wind through the pines. At first, the hike was beautiful in the way all early hikes are. The forest was dense and dark, shadows stretching across the path like fingers. The ground was covered in a mixture of pine needles and fallen leaves, and my boots crunched against the soft earth as I walked. Birds chirped here and there, and somewhere distant, the occasional rush of water hinted at a stream. The air smelled of pine, wet earth, and something else, something faint and musky I couldn't place. I didn't think much of it. Hours passed as I ascended the ridge. The incline grew steeper and the trail narrower. Rocks jutted out of the ground at awkward angles, forcing me to step carefully. I noticed that the forest was getting quieter. Birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to falter when I thought about it. The quiet was heavier, oppressive almost, like the trees themselves were watching me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it because I was tired. At some point, I took a wrong turn. I didn't notice it at first. The trail had split, and I assumed the narrower path was a shortcut to the ridge. It was not. Within 30 minutes, I realized I was in a section of the forest that didn't appear on my map. The trees were older here, gnarled and twisted, and the underbrush thick enough that it scraped against my legs as I pushed through. I kept moving forward, thinking I could reconnect with the main trail, but the forest seemed endless. Every time I stopped to look around, the path I had taken disappeared behind me. It was disorienting. Then I heard it, not loud, not obvious. A low rustling, but not from the wind. Something moving deliberately through the underbrush. I froze. My pulse picked up and I scanned the area. There was nothing visible, just the shifting shadows of the trees. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or another animal, but the sound didn't match. It was heavier, deliberate, too cautious to be a deer. I quickened my pace, trying to get back to the main trail, telling myself I had been careful before, and now I was just lost. I realized then that I had no sense of direction. The sun had moved higher, filtering through the canopy in patches, but there were no clear landmarks. The forest had swallowed everything familiar. I started keeping my flashlight ready, though it was still daylight. Every step I took felt louder than it should, my boots pounding against the earth, my breath coming fast. I could hear the rustling again, always just behind me, sometimes to the side. I never saw anything, but I could feel it. Hours passed. I tried to retrace my steps, but quickly learned it was useless. Every tree looked like the last, every incline like the previous. My water was running low, my food untouched because I was too tense to eat. The shadows grew longer as the sun started to fall. I realized with a sick feeling that I would not reach the ridge before dark. Panic started creeping in. I found a small clearing, just enough to set my pack down and take stock of my supplies. The clearing was oddly bare, as if no one had been there in years. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that if I stayed put, I could wait for someone to find me. But I had no cell service, no way to signal for help, and the idea of spending the night there filled me with dread. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a stream or a landmark. As I moved, the rustling got closer. Every so often, I could swear I saw a figure moving between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. I couldn't run. The underbrush was thick, and the ground uneven. I had to keep moving slowly, carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. Then I stumbled over something. My flashlight swung wildly, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A large animal, maybe a bear, retreating into the shadows. I froze, realizing I had been walking in the territory of something dangerous. I had no bear spray, no means to protect myself. My mind raced, thinking of the advice I had read, telling myself to stay calm, to back away slowly, not to run. But fear was suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, and yet, I had no idea which way to go. I wandered for what felt like hours, slipping over roots and stones, trying to follow any sign of water or a path. Night fell fully. The forest transformed into a living darkness. I could hear the rustling close now, and sometimes the snapping of small branches as something moved. My flashlight was weak, and shadows played tricks on me, turning every tree into a looming figure. I finally stumbled onto a small stream. Relief hit me, but only briefly. I remembered reading that following water downhill could lead to civilization. I followed the stream carefully, keeping low, listening for any movement behind me. My clothes were soaked with sweat and the dampness of the forest. My hands were scratched and bleeding from brushing against branches. Hunger and exhaustion gnawed at me, but the fear of the rustling was stronger. At some point, I tripped again, landing hard on my side. My flashlight went out. I was plunged into total darkness. My hands scrambled for it, my heart racing, ears straining. That's when I heard it clearly. A low growl, close, deliberate. My stomach dropped. I scrambled to my feet, slipping in the mud, and ran blindly along the stream. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. I ran until I could run no more. I collapsed behind a large fallen tree, shivering, crying, and trying to catch my breath. Hours seemed to pass. I had no idea how long I had been running. My mind was foggy from exhaustion and fear. Then, faintly, I heard something different. The sound of human voices, shouting, calling out. My relief was instant. I screamed back, trying to make myself heard, waving my hands. Soon, lights appeared through the darkness. Hikers, searchers, or perhaps rangers, they had found me. I didn't care. I ran toward them, fell into their arms, sobbing, exhausted beyond belief. They checked me over, gave me water and food, and radioed for further help. I told them everything, the rustling, the darkness, the bear, the terror. They listened calmly, but the look on their faces told me they believed me. Eventually, I was escorted down the mountain, safe. I remember every detail vividly. The smell of the forest at night, the way the shadows moved, the growls and rustlings that kept me on edge. I realized afterward that a wrong turn, a bit of overconfidence, and the isolation had brought me so close to disaster. The experience changed me. I still hike, but never alone. I check and double-check maps, make sure someone knows my route, and carry more than I think I need. I cannot forget Black Pine Ridge, the terror of being lost, of not knowing what was behind the next tree. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the dark forest, the narrow path, and the shadows that moved with intent, reminding me that nature is beautiful, but also merciless, and sometimes it watches. That night, I learned a lesson about respect, caution, and fear that is carved into my memory. Hiking is not just a physical challenge. It is a confrontation with the unpredictability of the wilderness, where a single mistake can turn beauty into fear and quiet into terror. I had always considered myself someone who enjoyed solitude, someone who could handle the quiet, the isolation, the rawness of the outdoors. I'd done short hikes before, nothing extreme, nothing that scared me. But on this particular weekend, I decided to challenge myself. I wanted a trail that would take me deep into the forest, a place where there were no crowds, no easy exits, no sign of civilization for hours. I found a route online, a remote mountain trail that few people talked about. Only a handful of hikers a year made it through. That was exactly what I wanted. I set off early in the morning, the sun barely breaking the horizon. The air was crisp, sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth from a recent rainstorm. I carried only what I considered essential: a sturdy backpack, water, a few snacks, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. My boots sank slightly into the soft, damp soil as I started my ascent. The first mile was relatively easy. The path was wide, the incline manageable, and the forest seemed welcoming. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns on the ground. The air filled with the distant hum of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After about 2 hours, the trail narrowed and became less distinct. The occasional cairn or marker on a tree helped guide me, but I noticed that the path wasn't maintained. Fallen branches and rocks blocked parts of the way, forcing me to scramble over them carefully. My legs began to ache, but there was a thrill in the effort, a sense that I was truly venturing into untamed territory. Around midday, I stopped to rest near a small creek. The sound of water was soothing, a small reward after the relentless climb. I drank some water and ate a granola bar, listening to the forest around me. There was something about this place that felt untouched in a way that was both beautiful and intimidating. I checked my map and realized I was only halfway to the point I intended to reach. That was when I noticed the first unsettling detail. The forest around me had gone almost completely silent. The birds, which had been active in the morning, had vanished. No rustling of small animals, no chirping, no breeze in the treetops. It wasn't a heavy silence, but a sudden emptiness, as if the forest itself had paused. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, a flicker of unease, but I brushed it off. I reminded myself that it was midday, and many forest animals are quieter during this time. Resuming my hike, I followed the creek for a while, thinking it would lead me to higher ground. The trail became steeper and rockier. My boots slipped occasionally on wet stones, and I had to steady myself with a trekking pole. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, but I was confident I could reach my planned campsite before dark. That confidence faded when the trail ended abruptly. I had expected the path to continue, to wind its way upward as indicated on the map, but instead I faced a dense thicket of trees and undergrowth. The trail markers had stopped, and there was no clear way forward. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed different somehow, unfamiliar despite my previous progress. Every rock, every tree, every shadow looked foreign. I checked my compass. My bearing was correct, but the terrain didn't make sense. Then, a faint sound caught my attention, a low, steady crunching of branches and leaves. Not random, not like the scurrying of a small animal, but deliberate. I froze. My heart began to beat faster. I scanned the area, the flashlight still in its holder on my backpack, and used. Whatever it wasn't immediately visible, but the noise persisted, coming closer. My first thought was another hiker, perhaps lost like me, but as the moments passed, the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly but purposefully, as if following me. I didn't panic immediately, but the forest silence now amplified every sound. I could hear my own breathing, my heartbeat, the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I tried calling out, just to announce my presence, but my voice felt weak, swallowed by the dense forest. The footsteps didn't respond. They continued, slow and deliberate, echoing my movements. I decided to move, to put distance between myself and whatever was behind me. I kept walking, careful not to run, knowing that panicking in uneven terrain was dangerous. As I pushed forward, I noticed the trail markers again, faint markings on trees I hadn't seen before. They weren't official. They seemed carved by a hand, recent and rough. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever was ahead had been here before. I quickened my pace, trying to maintain calm while scanning my surroundings. Hours passed. The forest thickened, shadows lengthened, and the sky transitioned into twilight. My water supply was running low, and I hadn't seen a safe spot to set up a campsite. Every clearing seemed exposed. Every tree seemed a potential hiding spot for eyes I couldn't see. The footsteps continued intermittently, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always present. My nerves were fraying. Then I stumbled into a shallow depression, a natural basin that collected rainwater. I paused, leaning on my knees, chest heaving. That's when I saw it. Signs that someone had been here very recently. A partially buried backpack, a makeshift fire pit with charred wood, and footprints leading away. The prints were large, wide, and deep in the soft soil. They were human, but not like any hiker I had seen. They had a heavy gait, and some seemed almost deliberately placed, like someone wanted to be found or wanted me to follow. I realized then that I had two options: stay in place and hope the footsteps never returned, or follow the prints and try to find a more secure location. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew running blind in this terrain was reckless. I decided to follow the prints cautiously, keeping to the edges of the forest and avoiding open areas. Every step felt like a test of nerve. My flashlight, now in hand, barely cut through the gloom as the last light faded. The footprints led me to a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. In the center was a shallow, cave-like overhang, just enough to shield me from the wind. I set down my backpack, emptied my remaining water into my mouth, and tried to calm my trembling hands. The sounds of the forest had returned partially, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of small animals, but the unease remained. I spent a long, tense night in that overhang, listening for footsteps, watching shadows, and convincing myself to stay awake as long as I could. Every noise made me jump. The fire pit I discovered nearby seemed abandoned, but I kept glancing at it, expecting it to flare back to life. The night was long, colder than I anticipated, and the darkness oppressive. Yet by dawn, I was alive, my senses sharpened, and a strange clarity settling over me. Morning revealed more about the trail. In the pale light, I could see the path I had taken, winding precariously along rocky ridges and steep inclines. The prints I had followed disappeared somewhere near a small ravine. I didn't see anyone or anything that could have left them, and I realized the forest was a labyrinth. Its features could easily deceive the mind after hours of tension and isolation. I resolved to keep moving, this time more cautiously, following the map but cross-checking every landmark. After several more hours, I finally descended from the higher ridges and stumbled onto a clearer path, a maintenance trail that was part of a longer, known hiking network. Relief washed over me. The air felt different, safer. Birds sang freely, a gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, and the familiar smell of pine mixed with dry earth comforted me. Eventually, I reached the trailhead, where parked cars and a few fellow hikers confirmed that I was out of the wilderness. Looking back once, I saw the mountains rising behind me, mysterious and silent, as though nothing had happened. My backpack was heavier with exhaustion, my legs sore, but the fear and tension that had gripped me for nearly 24 hours began to dissolve. The forest was just a forest, beautiful, harsh, and indifferent. It hadn't wanted to hurt me. It had only challenged me, and I had survived. I left the trail with a sense of respect and caution that I had never felt before. Hiking wasn't just about strength or endurance. It was about awareness, judgment, and understanding the subtle signs the wilderness offered. And though I never discovered the origin of the footprints or the subtle footsteps that had haunted me, I knew one thing. The forest was alive in a way I could never fully comprehend, and survival depended on both courage and care. When I got home, I cleaned my gear, patched my boots, and sat for a long time replaying every moment. Fear had a clarity to it, a sharpness that left no detail unnoticed, and I knew with certainty that I would hike again. But I would never take the wilderness lightly again, never underestimate the quiet, patient